And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. It's terrific to have everyone here. What an excellent crowd and incredible conversations going on as they've been relayed to me by Olivia, who is joining me now, the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
It's fantastic to have everyone here, and welcome to XProtect, which is the 28th episode on the 28th day of September. It's interesting about XProtect because what you really have to consider when we get into this end of it is that you have not only an elusive political faction pulling the strings, but you also have to consider an elusive supernatural faction pulling the strings. And that's where my work has always crisscrossed. That's what dark journalism really, when you get right to the heart of it, is. It's balancing the deep state on one end and figuring out the mystery school connection. So when we got into all the things that we're doing with the X series, the X Steganography really takes us into a whole different category of understanding the work that we've been doing over the past 5 years. And what I'd like to say is that maybe here in this episode, we can kind of reveal the two sides for what they are and have them balance out. So very often you'll see that we do one end of the spectrum and come back into the other end of the spectrum. We're deep on the mystery schools. We're deep into anthroposophy in its wing. And then we'll come over here and we'll deal with the invisible plane aspect that Trump is putting on and the technology that he's balancing as he's trying to bring that forward. And there are those other forces that kind of weigh in between. And of course, when we do this work, we're assailed between two forces, basically the intelligence community on one hand and the marketing forces on the other. And those marketing forces sometimes will do something the intelligence agencies like, and so the intelligence agencies will help them, and the real story will get killed, and the official version and the fluff stuff will thrive. So what we're going to try to do tonight is clear away some of that, even though there have been decades of reporting around these issues. When it relates to XProtect, I can tell you that XProtect plugs in not only to the political process, as we've seen, but it plugs into these mysteries in such a deep way that when we get around to looking at things like the UFO file, like people who've had these kinds of experiences, we'll start to see that the marketing forces have really played them out after a particular pattern. But what we're going for is something quite different. And we're going to put the very best, and I mean the very best names forward in this episode who have tangoed, danced with XProtect. And we're going to see how they did it at these crucial times in history. And we're going to take that swing again from 2018 all the way back to 1888 and back again and have a little stop there in the 50s and 60s. And that's just the way that we're going to play it tonight. There is something special when we consider the idea of XProtect. I want to announce it right at the beginning so we understand what it is. Think about the term at all costs. So that is preserving a secret at all costs. So XProtect are the agency that will protect things at all costs. Now we have aspects that run through our intelligence agencies that have the same type of motto. But XProtect, guarding the highest secret, which is the X-Tech that resides inside the UFO file, they're charged with this particular edict. And what's interesting about it, from my perspective, is it seems to have gained, if anything, that realization that they will do anything to hold up that wall of secrecy around these things. What I think they're hiding, if you're somebody who's been watching what we do here on the X series in studying the X Steganography, that we can track through things like government agencies and all the way back through time in the mystery school's legacy to the Egyptian Book of the Dead and through the Middle Ages, that there's a kind of effect that takes place that people who have watched this show and studied this material know, that I call it Apotheum. And Apotheum arrives at the very root of what the secrecy is all about on the mystery school side, on the government side, and relating to the UFO file in the middle. When they've done those kind of psi experiments on the CIA side, and some of those people have come out of those programs, they've talked a little bit here and there And actually, it was Stansfield Turner, who was kind of an outside CIA director in 1970s. 79, he was appointed by Carter. And, you know, they were trying to clean up the CIA at that point because there were so many investigations of the JFK assassination coming. The Rockefeller Commission, the Pike Commission, the Church Committee. It was just endless. Everyone knew that the CIA had assassinated the president. And they just had to run through this process of weeding out these people. And what the CIA did is they went offshore and they formed something called the Safari Club. But Stansfield Turner, when he took over, he was looking at all the side projects that they had, trying to get at that whole kind of, you know, third eye end of the spectrum. And what happened was he came back and told his assistant director, "Oh, I had no idea. They're black, 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 black." Now that means those things that we know now as remote viewing, or the kind of psychic explorations they were doing. And Stansfield Turner, you know, he was really giving us the hint, or giving his assistant the hint there, that he had no idea they were working in this kind of black magic world around things relating to national security and the kind of power structure that the CIA is a part of, working with this deep state structure, which really reaches out all the way to Wall Street and the oil companies, and not just the intelligence agencies, but the contracting agencies around those intelligence groups. So, you know, when they hire someone out like a Blackwater, which I believe is called Academy now with an I, it's such a nice thing to put on this humanitarian group that they send into these countries to grab people and do rendition. It's really quite kind of amazing. So when we're looking at it from this perspective, we're really seeing that these agencies are connected with a huge power structure. And so their secrecy becomes paramount in terms of national secrets and all the rest of it. But Apotheum and the UFO File and that type of secret is, according to physicist Robert Sarbarker, who was in charge of the program, came out and talked about it and died shortly after. And by the way, of course, as I've pointed out in this program, is wiped out of the history books pretty much. And go ahead and try to find his Wikipedia page. You're not going to find it because he's a non-person who's been diced down the memory hole. But the question we arrive at is why? Why all of the secrecy, and why this level of kind of lethal protection around it? Is it simply political secrets, national security style secrets? Certainly that's one level of the secrecy. But this level, which is take no prisoners, relates directly to XProtect and relates to their job shepherding Apotheum so that no one else gets their hand on it. Quick thing about Apotheum. Anytime you hear about things that relate to, in these UFO encounters, what I call reality distortion effects, so time effects, where people become invisible, you know, all these unusual things, you know, they kind of get abducted through walls and things like that. Those types of effects in UFO abduction cases are very important, and people like John Mack and others have studied them over the years. But what we get from it, really, if you just take out the whole fantastic aspect, is whatever takes place when we are getting impacted by these UFO contacts, these people who've had these experiences, their reality gets turned upside down. But it's not just them. So it's not just a perception thing or their consciousness has shifted, as a lot of people would suggest. Actually, we've known that different towns have experienced blackouts. We see all this kind of strange things that when these craft land, you know, there's nothing grows there. We start to see environmental impacts. This is all because of a second form of physics leaning in, moving in to the space that we call ordinary, everyday reality. That space is also transgressed in other ways. For example, when we get into things like the mystery schools, when we get into these kind of groups doing rituals and things like that, or when we get into breaking dimensions like they do at CERN, which is the show we just came off of, and doing CERN and Ada Lovelace's work, and we had Gigi Young here. And if Gigi Young is in the audience, a big shout out to Gigi, who's an incredible ally for the X series and has done remarkable work on our behalf, and we really appreciate it. But you will see that when we get into that end of it, it's the same thing. Again, it's the secrecy. It's almost like you have to imagine on the mystery side, a poltergeist activity, which breaks every physics law in the book. And then on the other hand, you have this strange kind of UFO activity, which also has tendency to do the same thing, like disappear in a heartbeat, in a flash. So that whole effect, that entire strip, I've called Apotheum. The reason I've called it Apotheum, I mean, there's a lot of things I could say about the word, but suffice to say, it goes back, it has a Greek root, and it's about as close as I could find there. And it's not really a very, in modern times, you won't find it used at all. But they understood it very well back then, and it applies directly in this case. Now, I want to start with the first person on the, I'm going to break this up into two sides. We're going to look at the political XProtect, then we're going to look at the mystical XProtect on both sides. And there's going to be a lot of weird celebrities and stuff in this one, which, I don't go in for that too much. I'm not much of a celebrity hound, am I?
Not at all.
It's always good to have witnesses on that. But it is great to have everyone here. I do want to mention that you do want to sign up for our newsletter at darkjournalist.com. It's the best way to go because we've been having a lot of very unusual activity around social media.
For sure.
And as it turns out, my way of looking at it is very simple. If you and I have our own communication channel, it's the best way to go. So when you go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter, keep track of the X updates. There's a page called xmaster.php, so darkjournalist.com/xmaster.php, and that gives you all the updated shows that are happening. And then from now on, I've noticed this because we've had announcements on Facebook and Twitter and all the rest of it about the shows, and sometimes people miss when they're going to happen. They're pretty much always Friday at 7 unless we do a double episode. But every Friday now, we're going to announce, we're going to have the link directly off the homepage of the site so you can come directly into the show. So darkjournalist.com is just set that as your main goal, and make sure you sign up for the newsletter so we're in touch. How are we doing over there, Ms.
We are doing great. The chat has been going wild for hours, actually.
Well, it started
early.
I
started early, and we all started. I think people are catching on that they can get more of the show if they tune in early.
Absolutely. I see a lot of incredible regulars out there. And there's lots of good questions swimming around already.
Yes, and please remember to ask them in all caps.
Caps.
There are so many more people in the chat that it's getting harder and harder for me to catch up. And so I need them in caps so that I can isolate those questions and put them over and save them for later in the show.
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting too, because we're on this incredibly wild XProtect topic, but it's been a wild week. There's been a lot of news pouring out. We've been in the middle of that storm. And we're also in the middle of this Indonesian tsunami, wild electricity coming out of that. And it's just like the whole atmosphere is crackling here on this Friday, this 28th day of the 28th episode. We got to love those configurations because they come up oh so rarely. So let's go to the first person that danced publicly with XProtect. Although there have been quite a few who danced before him, but certainly he was the most prominent. And it's this guy, Jim Garrison. Jim Garrison was the DA from New Orleans, and he had a very interesting career, having worked in the background before that, having worked with Guy Bannister. And Guy Bannister was in charge of the original X Files, and those were files that had to deal with the UFO file, where these cases came up relating to people having these contacts or encounters, and they would send agents like Garrison and Bannister out to figure out what was going on. But Garrison's big claim to fame is that he was the only person to ever bring a trial in the case of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, because he ran across some very unusual information, having had the accused assassin in New Orleans, which is where he was the DA. So it was kind of a natural thing for him to get in there and figure it out. But he had very interesting connections, because not only was Garrison in New Orleans, as was Oswald, but Oswald's handler in New Orleans was someone named Guy Bannister, who, as I just mentioned, was in charge of the X Files for the FBI as the chief of the Chicago office. So now he was in New Orleans pretending to be a private eye, and he had Oswald going out to pretend to be a communist and hand out literature and things of this nature. Now, there's all sorts of unusual things that other researchers have touched on, but nobody really understands. And I won't go too deep into the assassination side, but most of it related directly to this idea of the advanced technology that was inside the UFO file coming out through a Kennedy administration, and that Kennedy administration becoming mired in a battle against these deep state groups. And at the very core of that group was XProtect, the political aspect of XProtect. So what happened there was a huge dust-up that, you know, was right at the very pinnacle of power. And we know the result was that Kennedy got assassinated, and that no one believed it because the story was so ridiculous about magic bullets and all sorts of wildness. So we understood that something else had taken place, but the media had covered it up. That's the way the society viewed it some 50 years ago. They understood that they had been had. So Garrison brought this trial forward, and it was a very public affair, you know, in the sense that, you know, like on the Tonight Show and things like that, they'd be like, we're going to have people talking about the Garrison trial and all that. And he very blatantly came out and said the CIA assassinated President Kennedy. It's quite important because the CIA, if we understand their role, if we understand the role of the intelligence agencies, they're very deep in there with this whole idea about protecting the UFO file and holding that process and sort of moving aside the leaders as they see fit. Now, this got them into trouble a few times, but they come back over and over again. Their new tactic is to take over movements like we see with Tom DeLonge's TTSA movement. It's completely CIA dominated. And you have people like Luis Elizondo, who was the assistant to, you know, his boss was John Brennan, who's the CIA drone king for Obama. So we have to kind of keep all this in mind, which is whenever you get CIA people around UFOs, they always have an agenda, and the agenda is secrecy and diversion and all the rest of it. So when you see them electing themselves as a corporation and coming out and sort of taking over, you know, that we're going to take over the UFO field, and, you know, we're going to have all these mainstream media connections, and we're going to trot out Elizondo, who's a counterintelligence guy, i.e. good at lying. And then, you know, the whole machinery around ufology, which is why it's so absurd, and I don't really participate in it very much. You know, MUFON and all those people have him on there as their top speaker and all this nonsense. This is a CIA counterintelligence agent. That's the kind of thing that the entire UFO community was built up to throw out and force the truth out of. Now they have them kissing up to them. You see how that works. So those programs that served in the past, like Coast to Coast and things like that, completely out of date now, because now the very thing they've warned against, they're part of, which is promoting a CIA intrusion into the UFO file. The only reason the CIA wants to do that is because there was an entire op built for when Hillary Clinton got into office. And that's why they even had Hillary talking about this issue over and over again in these meetings. One of the things that I want to really clear up about Garrison that's interesting is Garrison didn't only run into problems when he was trying to try Clay Shaw, who was a New Orleans businessman who had all these ties to Paperclip, which was a Nazi program, of course, as we know, for American program for bringing Nazi scientists over. But Garrison had something else, I think, you know, which is, it's an extra block, let's say. It wasn't just that he was blocked and the media was going after him because he was on the trail of the JFK assassination. He had run into something. He had hit a structure. He had actually hit XProtect. And I'm going to show you the moment that he hit it. I'm going to read it to you. And it's a personal conversation between him and someone named Warren Hinkle, who ran a magazine called Ramparts, which was really kind of cutting edge stuff. Half political, half, I don't know, it's sort of like The Village Voice, if you're familiar with it. It had that kind of political edge, but it covered pop culture and all the rest of it. Very popular movie magazine at the time. So Warren Hinkle, he was the publisher of Ramparts, and he started to do this exchange with Garrison, and he found that shortly thereafter that he was being followed. by kind of what were Men in Black types. And the Men in Black come up over and over again in this episode because, of course, XProtect is where that whole mythology comes out of. Now, it's also, the Men in Black thing has been sort of stigmatized and commercialized and marketed out the window. But the truth is, the fact of the matter comes from all these individual cases where these people would be visited after they had a UFO sighting or they hit into that UFO secrecy. So this is really an important kind of aspect for us to understand. Okay, this is Hinkle's account of a November 5th, 1968 conversation that he had with Garrison. Now remember, the actual trial of Clay Shaw would take place in the spring of '69, so this is really just before. And but it had hit all the papers that Garrison was doing this, and they were trying to make it into a real circus in the media. I don't think the media ever went after an individual to the extent that I've seen them. If looking at their reputation over the past 60 years, they went after Garrison, I think, more than anyone. So, but he was sharing these things with Hinkle, and there's a little interesting things in Hinkle's autobiography. One of them is the fact that he was actually trying to get away from Garrison because Garrison was sharing this information, and now Hinkle realized, oh my God, yeah, I want to be this leftist, kind of fight the system guy. But Garrison's really getting me in the crosshairs of this thing, and I don't know what it is, but these people are following me, and my phone is tapped, and my mail's being opened. I have to get away from him. So he actually does all these things to kind of hide from him when these calls come in. He's like, tell him I'm in the mailroom, and then Garrison will call the mailroom. He's really tracking him down to share this information. So that just gives you some idea of where this was coming from. Okay, this is Hinkle's account. So he says, the caller was in no good mood to inquire about the weather. This is urgent, Jim Garrison said. Can you take this in your mailroom? They'd never think to tap the mailroom extension. Of course, Garrison was tapped nonstop. Garrison began talking when I picked up the mailroom extension. Quote, this is risky, but I have little choice. It's imperative that I get this information to you now. Important new evidence has surfaced. Those Texas oil men do not appear to be involved in President Kennedy's murder in the way we thought. It was the military-industrial complex that put up the money for the assassination, but as far as we can tell, the conspiracy was limited to the aerospace wing. The aerospace wing is the heart of where XProtect resides, as we'll learn. So again, as far as we can tell, the conspiracy was limited to the aerospace wing. I've got the names of 3 companies and their employees who were involved in setting up the president's murder. Do you have a pencil? That's Garrison for you. The companies that he listed were Lockheed, Boeing, and General Dynamics. One of the individuals that he mentioned comes directly into the heart of the XProtect, and he will show us the connection of XProtect to the Rad Lab, which we've covered on this program on a number of occasions. And he's also going to show us the connection between these defense contractors and XProtect. The names of the executives and their employ, whom the district attorney said had been instrumental in the murder of John Kennedy. I also logged a good deal of information about a mysterious minister who was supposed to have crossed the border into Mexico with Oswald shortly after and before the assassination. It wasn't a minister at all, Garrison said, but an executive of a major defense supplier in clerical disguise. That's really unusual. Garrison had really an incredible investigator's chops. And so at the end, I said that I had everything down, and Garrison said, a hurried goodbye. It's poor security procedure, he said, to use the phone, but the situation warrants the risk, so he understood what he was up against. Get this information to Bill Turner. He'll know what to do about the minister. I wanted you to have this in case something happens. Okay, and the name of the book is If You Have a Lemon, Make Lemonade by Ned Hinkle. Warren Hinkle. So, interestingly enough, Garrison has now figured out through these strange connections that he's finding. He's going in and he's researching the people, and they all seem to work at NASA. Every time he tries to find an in when looking at the great kind of move of the intelligence agency around the Kennedy assassination, he's running into NASA, Aerospace, Boeing, and he's starting to sense there's some structure there, some extra constitutional structure, but he can't figure out what it is. But he's realized, oh, that kind of regular thing about some assassination conspiracy. That has nothing to do with anything. It's this thing that's out there. It's basically an aerospace takeover of the entire country. Now, it's interesting because all of those connections throughout come directly into what I have tracked as the X program, which is all these programs that come into the public purview and turn into black projects. And we've tracked them here, and all the connections directly to Garrison's work are there, because in Guy Bannister's work, there's all those connections to Blue Gemini and Dinosaur. So I won't go through all those tonight, or Oswald and, the whole thing with him saying, I'm going to work at NASA and all that. But you get the idea. I mean, there's this whole kind of aerospace structure. And then we have Garrison investigating and moving along a regular investigation in the president's murder. And he runs into ex-Nazis, and he runs into X technology, and he runs into XProtect ultimately. So XProtect targets him and says, well, we'll take him out. And there were attempts actually on his life, but as it turned out, they decided the best thing to do with him, since he was such a high profile figure, was to ruin his reputation, which they worked on for a number of years. And it actually finally happened to the point where he became kind of a non-person before the 1990s, when Oliver Stone discovered his story and brought it out. And it was remarkable kind of redemption for Garrison at the very end. But Garrison understood and had interfaced with these kind of post-World War II fascist elements that had incredible technology and incredible finance. And when we run into things that are almost caricatures in our reporting that we see around this in alternative media, when they say Bilderberg or this kind of thing, it's this whole structure. It's a much bigger structure that is handling the parsing out of the financial and technological aspects. So, there's something I recently put out, part 2 of my interview with Catherine Austin Fitts on the secret Space Force. And it's quite remarkable because Catherine understands the government very well. And her basic summation was that, they're working with a map of the world that we don't have. Whatever that happens to be, they understand the threats that are involved. They understand the advantages. And we don't have the map, and that's where the imbalance is. That's why the kind of society is so schizophrenic. Now, for me, it's an extraordinary interview, by the way, and it is public right now, although part 3 is coming up just for subscribers. That thing, part 3 really is an incredible workout, but part 2 will give you a pretty good idea what it's all about. And what's amazing about Fitz, having come out of, the government working for Bush 1, having worked through HUD and all that, and done all that consulting for the Clinton administration. So she's really deep in that. Before that, she came out of Wall Street. So she understands how all that intersects. And what she told me was the defense agencies run the data systems. That's the heart of the problem. So here's Garrison in the same kind of milieu, and he's saying, I'm running into these defense contractors, Boeing, and I'm running into all these things that happen. Now, I did an episode, the X episode, dealing with Pine Gap, and I recommend that you do catch up on that one, because it's going to give you a bigger idea about what this one is all about. But we're going to get now into XProtect now that the scene is kind of set.
Can I throw you a question?
Yes, please.
Okay, Griffin Eagles 7 says, why did Lockheed Martin have the right to do the UK census poll in 2011? Red flag alert?
Well, there's an awful lot of backroom deals going on with that. Lockheed, people who know call it the United States of Lockheed, and it's a problem because Lockheed Martin has taken over to such an extent, and any tiny pushback against them, like when we had all this stuff with Trump coming out talking about the F-35 and saying it's invisibility technology, and everyone comes out and says, haha, Trump thinks we have invisible technology. What a crazy guy and all that stuff. I mean, this is Trump wanting to sport the invisibility technology. Trump's a very, my own observation of him is he's secrecy's nightmare because he can't help but brag about what we have. And the invisibility technology they've been working on for a long time, it definitely exists. To a certain extent, they even admit it. The problem is, again, we can look at it just politically as saying there's an advancing technology there and they're trying to figure out how to roll it out. That's true on one side. But the invisibility technology is also Apotheum. There's no doubt about it, that it relies and it draws on a certain type of technology that we haven't completely got a handle on yet. The ancient, the reason we have the X Steganography are because of these things that happened in ancient times. There's this echo back there of this massive destruction that took place, and the shifting of the poles and all this wildness that took place as a result of the misuse of this Apotheum distortion field. And we learned in that culture, and when we go back, we look at it, it's called Atlantis through Plato and all the rest of that. And the Mayans called it Aztlan. There's this echo of this advanced culture which got to this incredible height where the people became like gods, and then zap, overnight they were destroyed. So that cultural echo, I think, is very important when we look at the situation that we're in today, because, the kind of linear progression that we've seen where they're like, well, we had cavemen, and then we had some civilization, and then we had the Renaissance, and then us, everything works out that way. It's not true at all. You have incredible advanced culture back there, and then you have this legacy kind of digression. And, this is just the way that it works. And by the time you get to us, it's like a swing. We're kind of swinging back up. So we're getting the technical part together, but we've lost the entire spiritual wing of the party. And if you don't have the two in balance, you're in a lot of trouble.
Can I throw you another question?
Yes, please.
Okay. I know you did not plan on talking about this, but I know you know about it. Buddha Baby says, does Dr. Mary Sherman's death seem to be XProtect also?
Well, what's strange is that all the indications, one thing is for sure, with Dr. Mary Sherman was connected with the Garrison investigation, and she was connected because they were working on these cancer biological weapons to kill foreign leaders with, and she was part of that secret program. And she actually had a very high profile name as working for Dr. Oshner, who was like, kind of like the Surgeon General type guy. And she died very mysteriously, having run into a problem because she was working on a particle accelerator. And there's no doubt that when they discovered her body, half of it had been, her left arm had been completely disintegrated. And they were like, they basically found a lot of oddities because the whole apartment was burned up, but it was burned up in this odd way, and she shouldn't have been burned up in this way. And even if she were burned, it wouldn't have completely made her arm disappear. So her work with the particle accelerator, which, remember, the particle accelerator is what CERN is all about, and that's the highest point of the kind of CERN-style technology, which is to find the Higgs boson. They were working on versions of it. Remember, I pointed out on this program that the Varian brothers, who came out of the Theosophical Society, they discovered the klystron, which became the foundation for these particle accelerators. And they sold many versions of the particle accelerators even in the 1930s, like 1938, 1939. And so there was this great promise of what they could do, but there's something in there. There's something with that they discovered. And, we mentioned in the last episode with Gigi Young, Gigi's uncle, Dale Corson, he's kind of the main guy who set up the particle accelerator technology. And he's in this episode, actually. And he's right in there working with that NACA group, which was the pre-NASA group. And it's Werner von Braun's paperclip Nazis preparing our space program. So it is, you see, when we look at the space program from a technological point of view, you get a lot of it, but you miss crucial aspects. Jack Parsons, who we've touched on a few times, and I think that right now, strangely enough, there's a series going on about him called Strange Angel. But everyone's always fascinated about him because he was the father of our rocket program. But he was also the main disciple of Aleister Crowley. So that, if you understand that, if you get a little hint of this picture, which is, this is him and his ritual aspect over here, getting ready to engage the Apotheum there. If you understand him, if you think of him as the father of the rocket program, and then you see him in this ritual doing the kind of Golden Dawn ritual, Crowley-style ritual, then we get a much better idea than just studying the linear progression of the technology. Where do these people come from? Where are they getting help from? What is the supernatural aspect that brings us into this? So that brings us into the Men in Black. Did you have another one, Olivia? I mean, you don't have to. Did I miss your second part?
Well, I know there's more questions about Jim Garrison, if you want to go for that now.
Sure.
Okay, so JJK wanted to know, did Mr. Garrison know about the alien presence?
Well, this is the thing. By the time he had engaged XProtect, he knew that they were covering something pretty massive in the aerospace wing. And so engaging XProtect, he's thinking along the lines of what he's engaged with, which is an investigation into a crime. Because remember, he's a district attorney. So he's looking for a crime. And every time he tries to track down the leads, he finds a brick wall, and then he sends people subpoenas, and the CIA squashes them in Washington. So he's engaging a structure. He's, the thing that he's engaged with, that's XProtect, because XProtect will do anything, will take any chance. And many of his witnesses, were either scared off or killed. So, we have this incredible witness list of deaths related to his investigation. And then again in the 70s, when they do the reboot with the Church Committee and the House Assassinations Committee, it's the same thing. There's everyone who's scheduled to testify gets bumped off, and a lot of those are organized crime figures too. So there's this whole flow there in the deep state of finance on one side and the aerospace control on the other. And that secrecy that's in the heart of the aerospace companies, that's XProtect active. That, and what is it that they're moving? They're moving the UFO file. The UFO file holds what? It holds the same X technology that the mystery schools have been using steganography to move the knowledge of through their schools for centuries. So the X is really a breakthrough. I want to say this about X steganography. Steganography, better than cryptology, gives us the key. There's I'm just going to switch gears for a second here. There's a really important document that came out relating to esoteric doctrine. And this is the Trinosophia. And this is section 3. And what they have as an image, and this will help us really kind of grasp, I think, what we're up against and what they're trying to protect. They have these characters called X-Dogs who protect the crown. Let's take a quick look at these guys. Now, the crown is the knowledge, and these guys are engaged. You have to kind of, no one passes but by me rules are applicable here. So when we get into this, we see that the mystery schools held the information at this point, and the crown really was how to arrive at your spiritual self to use all knowledge, basically. Then all knowledge would be kind of integrated into your being. So we have to think in those terms if we're going to get a handle on the technological side. If we just come here really and try to study out how fast and how equipped and how kind of kick-ass the technology is, we're going to miss the boat, because in essence, that's only a small part of the picture. And it is fascinating. We can do great shows just on the technology. But the core of the X steganography relates to how the mystery schools handled the information over decades. Remember, we've only had the kind of technology that we've had, really, like, even look at us 100 years ago. There was still a lot of, horse and buggy action. I mean, we had cars, yes, but they weren't anything like the cars we have now. So it was a pretty kind of primitive setup even 100 years ago. And, I always, on this program, like to remind people about Rudolf Steiner's insight. being the head of spiritual science in the Anthroposophical Society, Steiner said in 1840, the mystery schools took a long look down that road, and they saw that within a century, because of the scientific materialism that was creeping in, we weren't going to make it. In other words, they were going to shut off our connection to that whole spiritual identity to such a degree that we would be just a cog in the wheel. We'd just be sucked into the technology. And they decided to let out a lot of information, and let it out they did. And sometimes it was sloppy, and sometimes it was kind of crazy. But things like reincarnation, things like psychic experience, things that relate to this kind of other aspect, the Akashic record, all of that came out through the mystery schools, largely at the end of the 19th century. And that's why this series always swings between the high advancement that we landed on now, technologically, while the social part has declined, and then the high advancement that they had leaking this out into the culture around the end of the 19th century through groups like Theosophy and the Anthroposophical Society. It's crucial. It's a cornerstone understanding. So we can't get to one without the other.
Brian Lau was reminding us that you were going to tell us the story of how Rudolf Steiner mysteriously died.
Wow. Yeah, that's a good memory. Well, we're going to do there's another Steiner episode coming up, so I'm going to save it. But Steiner did not die a natural death, and Anthroposophy is aware of that.
XProtect?
Well, I'll tell you, it's interesting. Steiner was poisoned, and it's quite an interesting thing, because he was at a tea party, and he came up to a young anthroposophist, and he told her, "I've just been poisoned. And basically, here's what you need to do." Now, Steiner hung in there just a little while longer. He was actually able to barely recover for a couple of weeks, but then he ultimately died. And there were groups who worked on the very kind of left-hand side of the mystery schools, as they refer to it, who were actually trumpeting their victory over eliminating Steiner, because Steiner had brought forward the mystery school teachings. He had succeeded. It's an interesting thing, because it's all a ladder, right? But Blavatsky had brought up so many things. She had brought forward the secret doctrine. She had given us Annie Besant and her great leadership. But Steiner was the crucial aspect who integrated the Western mystery part, and that's pretty much the whole ballgame. And they needed to get rid of him, and they did. But I'll get more into those details, as well as eurythmy, which is a crucial aspect of Steiner's work. And but I think all these groups are trying to give us something. It's really quite amazing, because we're very much taught to think in specialties. We're taught to specialize and to kind of keep things in certain categories. It's what Graham Hancock calls channel normal. When you get a piece of information that upsets the apple cart, for example, in Graham's case, he found all this information that threw Egyptology out the window. Well, Egyptology is actually something, most of their conclusions come from the 18th century. I mean, it's thoroughly antiquated, considering we can use X-ray and all this other stuff. Their list of kings and dynasties in Egypt is completely faulty. Casey had dated that structure in Giza with the pyramids and the Sphinx, the Great Pyramid, the same way that Graham Hancock was doing, having done the real hardcore work on it with people like John Anthony West. This was the nature of the thing. But these guys, the Egyptologists, even the ones who knew, because some of them had been sponsored by the Casey Foundation, let's not forget, Zahi Hawass and Mark Lehner, they took the Casey money to go over there and find the Hall of Records, and instead they maintained the status quo. They just found out how to play the game. Remember, Hawass was going to be part of the Egyptian government, so you can see how we get into a whole different conversation dealing with that. But yes is the answer, Olivia.
We're all set. You may
Fantastic.
Continue.
Unbelievable. And I want to remind everyone that you're watching Dark Journalist, and go to darkjournalist.com. Get over there, sign up for the newsletter. That's going to be kind of your launch pad. And when you get the newsletter, it's directly in your inbox, lets you know where to go. Like today, for example, everyone got their newsletter, and that's why you're here, probably. But that's what you're going to need. And we do the shows Friday night at 7 p.m. Eastern time. And coming up, whenever we get to the 10th episode, because we do them in rounds of 10. And, we figured out is maybe we have about 10 or 12% of the information that we have out in the X episodes, all 28 of them. But by the time we get to the 30th episode, we're doing a two-parter. So I guess that's, what is that, October 11th? Somewhere up there. It's that second week in October. Mm-hmm. And so that we'll do one on a Saturday, and we'll do it a little earlier for our European guests. And it's great to have everyone. These people write to me and they're like, I stayed up till 3 a.m. watching the X series live. And, it's incredible dedication. Of course, you can always go to sleep and wake up and the program's going to be there for you. But it's great to have you here. I do feel like there's something that happens when we're all here together working on the same thing together. There's some kind of lightning rod that hits. Synchronicity is a good point. And this is a wonderful word that Carl Jung brought into our vocabulary. And I'll tell you just a quick story about this. Actually, synchronicity, there's a story he tells about a woman who was taking pictures of her son just during a period in World War I, and this town got sacked. And then she had to flee with her son. And then a couple of years later, she was in a distant town, and they were kind of reselling all these things. And the camera with the film that she shot her son in before the war came along and uprooted their lives happened to be there in the window as she walked by. And she went in and bought the camera and had the film, and off she went. So, this is his very kind of key distinction of what synchronicity is all about. And it's good to keep that in mind. There's something that happens which doesn't work with the normal control of how we would determine reality, of what we would expect from reality. It's a deeper level of movement. And when we get into that level, we can advance in quantum leaps, or things can come to us so naturally and easily. So I think we need to keep that in mind, which is there's a whole other process going on around us as we're getting into these things, especially when you get around the XProtect and the X Steganography. You're in a whole different league. Okay, so I think we got a nice pinch of what Garrison was all about here. Now I want to look at what people kind of roll over whenever they're looking at ufology. They kind of roll through the 50s and they're like, there were people who believed in Venusians and stuff and have a good laugh about it. And they're right. There was all kinds of crazy misinfo that was put out directly by the intelligence agencies to get people off the trail, as it were. But some of the better types who were working on this, some of the most incredible, were people like Morris Jessup and people like Albert Bender. They brought these things forward, and what would happen is when they brought these things forward about sightings, and when they brought real good information relating to the UFO file out, people were getting on their side. The public was starting to understand what was happening. And this was very dangerous for the XProtect people, because the thing that they're protecting, again, remember, it's a higher secret than the atomic bomb. It's one of the important things for us to remember when speaking about the Kennedy assassination in Garrison, is that when I interviewed the Watergate lawyer, who was the best friends of E. Howard Hunt, who E. Howard Hunt was the top CIA super spy. And his good friend was Caddy, who's the Watergate lawyer, Doug Caddy, who a few times on this show, those interviews, I highly recommend them, but he asked him directly before he went to prison. Caddy said, what was the deal? Like, why did the CIA get involved in the Kennedy assassination? And he said the reason that Kennedy was assassinated was because he was going to give away our most vital national security secret to, the Russians and probably next to the public. And Caddy's like, what secret are you talking about? What's the top national security secret? And he said, basically, the UFO file. It's just the alien presence. Something about that UFO file and the X technology inside of it. They will do anything at all costs. It's a reality controller. they have to control the reality around it. When someone gets outside of that reality, the official reality around it, it's very dangerous. And we can see very often they discredit someone, maybe like Garrison. But there are sometimes lethal consequences too. There's a lot of cases of that. All right, let's look at some kind of the traditional look at the Men in Black here. So these guys are supposed to show up after a UFO sighting happens and a witness comes forward, and these guys come forward and say, don't say anything. And then, you know, they made movies and all this stuff about it, but really the core of it was that people over and over again, good reporters were coming forward and saying, these people keep encountering this whenever these things happen. There's waves of sighting in Michigan, waves of sighting in West Virginia, waves of sighting in New Hampshire. And these people would come forward and have these incredible stories to tell about being intimidated by very unusual people. Now, these aren't normal people coming to visit them who are just Air Force intelligence or something like that. John Keel, who did the kind of yeoman's work on all of this, he goes into great detail. I'll tell you a weird thing about John Keel, too, which is that I read his first book. I read his book, The Eighth Tower, when I was 9 years old. So a long history there with John. And John is just an incredible writer. And if anyone's ever seen the Mothman Prophecies movie with Richard Gere, that's all based on John's book on the whole case of Point Pleasant in West Virginia, and it's absolutely chilling stuff. They did a good job with it, and he is the main character, so Richard Gere is playing our friend. The Men in Black have been portrayed in certain ways. Interestingly enough, Frank Edwards was a real specialist writer and brought us the Men in Black as the theme. People had talked about it, but he really put it together. And he had a big fan who was in celebrity showbiz, and it was David Bowie. And when they asked Bowie to play the man who fell to earth, he said, "Can I dress him?" And Bowie, being so kind of, you know, playing this alien and reading about Frank Edwards' Men in Black stuff, he created the kind of Man in Black style image here. That's him in The Man Who Fell to Earth. And he's talking with Rip Torn there, who's supposed to be one of these scientists, saying, what if this was a weapon? You know, would this bother you? And playing the kind of Men in Black role of an alien investigator. We have to keep that in mind, which is the Men in Black theme. It is directly, anything that we've heard about it is like a fraction of what the XProtect is. So that whole idea of a group showing up that's not quite normal, not quite human, and having unusual effects. Let's read some of those effects, actually. I listed them because as you get into this, it's quite something. The symptoms, people feel hypnotized when they deal with them. They also feel sick, nauseous physically. So there's a number of witnesses who basically didn't get the message to stop talking and would die of a cerebral hemorrhage. Now, oddly enough, Frank Edwards, who wrote the book about the Men in Black and Flying Saucers Serious Business, was the real hardcore writer and a friend of major political figures, including Harry Truman. And I've got a shot of them together, actually, I'm going to show here in a moment. But I want us to get like a handle on this function of how they die. I think it's very interesting. It's very often this cerebral hemorrhage. So, in fact, Edwards died that way. Interestingly enough, there was a show in the 60s called The Invaders. This is a shot of it with David Vincent, of course. And we know her from Bunny Lake is Missing.
Yes.
What's her name again? Carol
Lindley.
Amazing. She's kind of the Pleiadian here, working on it. And the aliens that Roy Thinnes is pursuing, their favorite method of disposing of their humans that are getting in their way are this, giving them this cerebral hemorrhage. Now, they also have a strange, like, finger, which this is all taken from those cases. But again, you can see this was in the public consciousness at the time. We're getting an idea of how these people were hearing these stories and translating the information. When you get to the 90s and stuff, and shows like the X-Files, which again came from Frank Scully's work in the 50s, because he knew that the FBI kept X-Files. I'm going to show you a real X-File tonight that I haven't presented on the program ever. That's a federal document, and it is related directly to our ex-witness who'll be coming on the program, not tonight, but soon. And I'm going to just give us some indication of what was in the records there. But so a classic case involving the XProtect, I think, is very misunderstood relating to the Men in Black. But it has to do with this Dr. Hopkins in 1976. And you'll hear a lot of people talk about this story when you deal with ufology and when you're looking at it from that end of the spectrum. And they do a good job, actually. So I'm just going to do a quick outline. But basically, he kept having these clients come in talking about these experiments, these experiences they had where they had been kind of experimented upon, they felt. And it all came after this weird wave of sightings there in Maine. And Maine is very much like that. You know, Maine and New Hampshire, whenever you drive up there, and they're very close to us here in Cambridge. But it is just, you know, endless trees, endless lakes. It's quite untouched in a number of ways. And it's kind of a perfect place for those types of encounters to happen. Of course, Betty and Barney Hill, their encounter happened in Exeter, and that's just like mountains. And, you know, I mean, if you get outside of Exeter, it's all mountains and woods. But interestingly enough, he made a bold move when he was talking to different people about it, that he was actually going to get some of these cases out. He's sort of like a very early version of like a John Mack guy. And people have forgotten about this Hopkins. He's not Bud Hopkins. He's a different one. So he's moving it around through his different contacts, and this big newspaper gets him on the phone, and they go through the details, and he's like, you know, this is really starting to happen. So he hangs up the phone, and immediately as he hangs up the phone, there's this guy at his door. Or is it a guy? Is it a guy? Is it a woman? Is it a being? Something weird is going on there. And as we know, people like Nick Redfern and John Keel have really gone into how odd the presentation of the XProtect Men in Black people are. And I'm going to show that there's a good case to be made that a lot of these things are coming directly from a kind of astral place. And I want to refer to that group working in XProtect as Astral Agency, because when we understand the mystery school roles, then things like them popping in and out. For example, in the episode that we did on Gurdjieff, when his student, Ouspensky here, was talking about working with him and these strange kind of things that Gurdjieff was doing in interacting with him, like talking through his chest and things like that. But he also said that when he would leave Gurdjieff and take a train to go back home, you know, to Moscow, that Gurdjieff would pop in on the train and just pop out. So he had the ability to shapeshift and pop in and out. So Gurdjieff came out of those mystery schools. Whatever he was doing, he was exhibiting this weird apotheum, which is what they hold in those mystery schools, the ability, what we basically call magic. But I'll tell you another thing, which is that Ouspensky is a very grounded, scientific kind of a guy. For him to put that on record, you know, the book came out after he died, but he had prepared it that way. But in essence, you have to realize that that's the type of ability. So instead of just thinking of it as some fantastic alien thing, we can think of it as some fantastic astral thing. It's a better way to think about XProtect, Men in Black. Remember, that's the supernatural side. XProtect has two sides. The regular political side, where they railroad people like Garrison. And then there's this other side, when they're dealing with witnesses, and you get these strange people like Men in Black coming forward. Now, Jim Keith was also someone who did a remarkable book on the Men in Black, but he's a more modern guy, having been around in 2000, but he died a mysterious death. And John Keel was tracking all these people and saying, it seems like all these UFO investigators who engage with this Men in Black thing that I'm calling XProtect here, they all seem to die either like on June 24th or very close to it. So again, you're dealing with occult dates, occult naming systems, occult numbers. And I think we have to keep that in mind to really get a handle on what's happening here. Okay, let's go a little bit further. Keel, in his research, found that these people... Oh, I guess I didn't finish the story of Hopkins. Let me do that first. I'm getting ahead of myself, Olivia. What do you think of that? Unbelievable. So Hopkins, he answers the door, and the Men in Black comes in, and he says, in a kind of weird, robotic voice, it's so unnatural. And again, Hopkins starts to get almost sick dealing with him. He starts to tell him things about himself, like, you have X amount of children, you bought your watch in Guatemala, and right now you have some change in your pocket, and it's a quarter and a dime. And he does all these weird games with him, and then he has him pull out the quarter, and then it's almost like a magic trick where he makes the quarter glow and then disappear. Very odd stuff. So the doctor's starting to get freaked out. And so the Man in Black, who's standing there talking to him, says to him, well, I'm going to tell you something, which is that we gave Barney Hill a heart attack. And it's interesting because Barney Hill was the early contactee who really set off the entire movement, the entire UFO wave. And it's Betty and Barney Hill. We all know the case. And they are the classic case, and they're worth revisiting. It's almost like revisiting the discovery of America or something, because they really are the breakthrough case. And, he was a postman and she was a social worker. And he was doing that drive, working in Boston, driving back up to Exeter. And we've done that drive a few times. It's a nice drive. What I would say about this, though, that's kind of interesting, I guess I should sort of show this. So they have this incredible encounter, and then it takes 5 years working with what to uncover it? It takes 5 years working with a hypnotist. Well, what did Franz Anton Mesmer leave us? He left us the foundations of hypnosis. De Puysegur, who worked with Mesmer's stuff after Mesmer got thrown out of France because he was too much of a threat to the medical establishment there. He went on and took it a level further. He developed telepathy in hypnosis, where he could hum a tune in his head and have somebody who was in a hypnotic trance sing the same song. So they were demonstrating all kinds of things. When we get into Betty and Barney Hill's case, they have all these troubling memories and all these troubling things happen, but it's a hypnotist who works with them over 5 years that uncovers the stories. So again, hypnosis, let's think of it as its mystery school function. I mean, Edgar Cayce, for example, gave his psychic readings because of the fact that he developed self-hypnosis. So hypnosis is the key. It's kind of like the way in for a lot of this. So when they uncover their experience that's been wiped out, Betty and Barney Hill, they go through this process of reliving the whole thing. But they're very normal people, and she was a social worker and kind of a pillar of the community, and pretty daring because they had a mixed marriage in 1961, which is pretty unheard of at the time. So they're definitely up there in New Hampshire. And they made a very plausible case. And, they went on record on a number of occasions with Keel and other people saying, well, we've heard about these men in black, and they follow us, basically. When we go to a restaurant, when we go to different things, they're always hanging out, and they're very awkward, very unusual. And their presence is very strangely, they order food and they don't eat it. I mean, it's quite unusual. Betty Hill had quite an interesting telepathic conversation when she was abducted with someone that she later just referred to as Junior, but she sculpted, spending time working on this image, and this is what she sculpted. Now, I've always found something very unusual about this, but she called him the leader, and she gave him the name Junior, and all these different things that he told her were actually quite remarkable. But the face and the presentation and the whole thing bothered me from the word go. And so tonight, I want to reveal something for the first time. And it's definitely going to put a smile on your face, but I've figured out really that this image, Junior, is a female image, in that I want to suggest something kind of quite remarkable relating to the case. But I want you to look at the same image with hair. Olivia?
I know. I love it.
Your impression?
I've seen that person walking down the street about 10 times a day.
Junior is definitely, this is a woman. This is a memory of interacting with a female. And as we go deeper into these cases, I started to wonder about XProtect and the women around XProtect. And what I started to realize is that the whole idea of Men in Black is the kind of marketing concept on top. By and large, the cases are kind of an equal balance of, they're just different methods for contacting these people. These women that would show up after these cases, very often, they would show up under a different guise, and they would be in the kind of way of getting information. In one of these really hardcore cases, this woman shows up and asks almost like census questions after mass sighting. And I'm going to go into this one a little bit because it's quite fascinating, if I could find her. And what's interesting to me about it is she really kind of represents this other aspect that we're trying to dive into. And the name of the person is Aura Rains, and you're going to find her work among this early ufology stuff. It's very pivotal to look at her stories. But what she would do is she would ask the people involved what kind of dreams were they having, which is a weird thing to ask, you know, for a survey question. What does that got to do, kind of thing? Was anyone having weird dreams? So Aura had this kind of strange presence, and then a number of different women were showing up doing the same thing, and Keel tracked them throughout, to the point where, you know, at one point they put out a book called Women in Black, which you've seen some of those. So it is quite interesting when we start to look at that aspect of it. Let's see if I can find Aura Rains here. Just bear with me. While I'm finding her, Miss Olivia, why don't you tell me what's
Tessa
cooking over there?
is in the chat tonight.
Hey,
and
Tessa.
she just said that the Men in Black tried to kill Philip K. Dick.
Yes.
And I asked her how, and she
Yes.
said hypnotism and sleeping pills.
Now, is that the wow, Tessa? That's Tessa Dick,
It is
who is
Tessa
the
Dick.
former wife of Philip K. Dick, who's an extraordinary visionary writer, and she's quite an excellent writer in her own right. And you know, it's interesting because I was aware of break-ins in relation to Philip K. Dick and the work that he was doing, and he was definitely touching on themes, whether he was reaching them unconsciously or whether he had access to some information that when you go back there and look at it, he's really tapping into that X formula. I don't know how, but he's doing it. And I'm not surprised that they went after him the way that they did. I'd be very interested to hear more details about that.
Definitely.
Let's take a quick look at Keel as I find Aura Rain here. That's Keel when he's hunting down these stories. And what he's finding is that these women are showing up asking these unusual questions. And they're also asking, you know, kind of leading questions. They're creating a hypnosis thing so that people forget the wave of sightings that they've seen. And they're kind of testing things out, but they show up again and again, and then they promise to come back or leave them a copy of the survey or whatever. And inevitably, they wind up pretty much disappearing, which I always find interesting. So it looks like we're dealing with something else there. So just like with the Junior memory, it seems to be through the hypnosis and through the whole thing, there's definitely what we call a kind of a woman in black dealing with her. And this is why she remembers this very feminine thing. But whenever you hear her talk about it, it's all telepathy. So the idea, very often the occupants, the actual beings that they encounter, have a kind of sexless quality to them. And, especially when people talk about the Greys and something. But you'll notice something when you look at Betty Hill's version of this encounter. I mean, it's not really like Grey at all, if you think about it. When you think about the eyes and you think of all that. So you wonder how much of that Grey symbolism is kind of a put on, in a sense. It's sort of it's a caricature of this real experience, and that she's pointing out, this kind of, this figure is almost human. I mean, it's just about human. So if we go the extra mile and say, maybe that is a human, then, instead of just thinking of it as a MyLab experience, maybe we could start to get a deeper aspect of what exactly is going on there. Okay, let's keep rolling. I want to engage this occult aspect because there was actually a photographer whose daughter got into occultism, and they did this whole series of articles in the French version of Vogue, believe it or not. And it was quite remarkable. I've always been blown away by the imagery involved. This is one of the pictures of it. Let's take a look at this. You might remember having seen this character. But I got from a subscriber part of a translation of the article that this was in French Vogue. And it was talking all about how there's this kind of a wave of fascination over the past decade or so with kind of the darker aspects of that occultism in places like France and in places like Paris. And it was very interesting to me because I was starting to see that this was, we see these things trying to normalize and roll out things related to the UFO file over and over again. The Tom DeLonge thing saying like, wow, man, Luis Elizondo's really got his handle on it, and just forget that he's a CIA counterintelligence agent, and it'll be okay. The same type of thing we've seen related to deep occult imagery. There's always an op around that too, and I do feel like there's a place for that, engaging that esoteric side. And when they tilt it and it becomes like just straight up black magic that they're reflecting back, it's almost a way to discourage other people from going into it, because then they'd be thinking, wow, if I study meditation, am I going into black magic? It's very important to keep people away from those power centers, let's say. And I want to remind everyone that you're watching Dark Journalist, and we definitely want you to go right now to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter. Get in there and make that happen. Make sure that we're connected at this point. What have you got?
What year was that Vogue article?
The Vogue article, I believe, was 2013, and it is quite remarkable. I've tried to get more information on the guy and his daughter, and the more, it's a kind of a developing thing, but I did get the translation finally. I've been waiting for it for like a year and a half.
Do you want to bring up the three breasts thing right now? We're talking about fashion and transhumanism.
We'll save that for the transhumanist episode. But yes, they are rolling out these very unusual prosthetic third breasts in these shows in Milan, these fashion shows, and it's quite interesting the way they're kind of taking a handle on it. All right, I mentioned Frank Edwards earlier, and I promised you a picture of him. That's Frank Edwards, the biggest UFO author of the period, standing there with President Truman, who was his ally, very good friend, knew him well. And Edwards was well known, well loved in DC circles, and his books, Flying Saucer Serious Business, The Men in Black, all the rest of it, they didn't have any problem standing around with him. Nowadays, if a guy wrote a book called Flying Saucers Fantastic, you think someone like Obama would stand with him? Probably not. But we get kind of a handle there on Frank Edwards. Frank Edwards' basic thesis about the Men in Black was that there was a government group that was coming in and intimidating witnesses out of sharing their experiences, very much like Keel and very much like the originator of this, Albert Bender. He wrote the first Men in Black book called, I think it's UFOs and the Three Men. And that's a really early book, maybe like 1950, somewhere around there. And when you get into those early cases, the very first snapshot on record, according to people like Keel, of the Men in Black experience in this era is from the 1947 Maury Island case. All the people around the Maury Island case, it gets stranger and stranger. And I can't spend too much time on the different cases, but the Maury Island case, I will tell you, includes Guy Bannister, you know, our friend who coined the original term, flying saucers, and that's Kenneth Arnold, who was the pilot who brought it in. He's involved in the case. He gets hired as a private investigator to go figure out what happened. But basically, we have 3 donut-shaped UFOs hovering over this guy's boat off the coast of Washington, and part of something falls off of the UFO onto the guy's boat and burns his dog. And the Air Force freaks out and gets involved. But there's strange connections all the way through it to this deep structure that I started with, which was Garrison and all the rest of it. There's a guy out there named Ken Thomas who wrote a book about Maury Island. And that's where most of those details are. So I highly recommend it. Now, tonight, I'm going to show you this. And this is in lieu of bringing on our ex-witness. This is something in the record that they were, because they had handled a report dealing with UFOs, they got accused, basically, of, in order to keep them quiet, they had their own kind of Men in Black experience. But if you look at what they are charged with relating to mishandling this UFO report that came through about UFOs coming in and hovering in the atmosphere, it's a very interesting term here. It's on the record. This is the actual federal document, Espionage X. That is espionage relating to the X technology, which sits in the UFO file. So, you know, we have to understand where they're coming from. Did everyone get a good look at that? I hope that they did. But the Espionage X cases should be something, a kind of a place of exploration. It's good. My camera freaked out after that last one. It's a little too much X for the camera. There is a kind of an interesting thing relating to this. Now, Albert Bender, to flip back for a second to his experience, he also, in the early 50s, touched on this X and got kind of roughed up the same way the ex-witness did that I just showed the records of. But he had something else, which is known as Bender's occult altar. And you can see Bender was kind of into the occult. And this idea now that when they get people on this, around this line of things, that they will send in the specialists, the XProtect specialists, to deal with them. That's where a lot of the Men in Black aspects come from. What I'm suggesting is that the Men in Black aspect is a complete astral agency, that they do not handle, it's not a regular government agency coming forward. Deep in the UFO file is the same thing that resides in the mystery schools, therefore the same level of knowledge. You know, if someone were to go into a mystic lodge to try to get secret knowledge, they might expect, since they're aware of the environment, that they would be dealing with kind of invisible protection around things. Well, this aspect of the Men in Black goes into this astral agency idea. They are able to come in from this kind of strange place and intimidate people, and they're so unusual because they're actually an astral projection. They're not a physical human being. This is an important thing for us to get our heads wrapped around. How would the CIA, how would some of these agencies get their hands on that kind of information, that kind of knowledge? We know that the mystery schools have moved that kind of knowledge through the centuries. We know that there are very deep aspects of secrecy relating to Masonry, for example, and that Vannevar Bush, who ran the UFO file, was the master Mason of the MIT Lodge. It's about 15 minutes, 10 or 15 minutes from here. So when we think about that, then we start to understand that there are those aspects that understand the secrecy. But it still doesn't explain the appearance of the men or women in black in this case. John Keel got very confused because over and over again, people would say, well, they kind of look Asian, but not really. So he got very disturbed about this, and he put together a stack of pictures like this stack of different types. And he went from Egypt, Asia, Africa, the Pacific Islands. He went all over, and he would sit down with each witness and say, which one looks the most like who you saw? Now, everyone, and I mean, according to him, it was a shutout, a complete slam dunk of people choosing the same person. This was the person. It's a Laplander. Now, the Laplanders are quite fascinating because they are known in Europe, in that part of the world, and they, predominantly like northern Sweden is where they're known from, but they reside in a vast area there. And what's fascinating is they're all very well known for these mystical traits that they have, and their incredible mastery over that end of things. Very often, having been deep away from regular culture and society, their progression, their connection with their ethereal selves, their ethereal bodies, this whole other world, they're very closely connected with. So the Laplanders had the closest resemblance to the men in black. Now, very often they would say, well, they seem to be holding things back or wearing a hat or sunglasses to kind of disguise their appearance. And we get all kinds of wild accounts related to this. But the Laplanders themselves, we have some very interesting early accounts of them. First of all, there were groups in the Golden Dawn that attempted to imitate some of the rituals that they do. So there's a history there of groups leaning back into them. And of course, the one that I found the most interesting came out of the Theosophical Society. So let's read some of these reports to get a handle on who we're dealing with. By the way, as I mentioned Aura Raines earlier and the cases that she was involved in, she's kind of the most popular woman in black showing up after these cases. And she was incredibly telepathic and hypnotic, and apparently could brainwash a subject instantly. So this is the artist's description of her, and it has to do with these eyes and the kind of deep pupils that are going on here. There is Aura Raines. You get a little of those eyes, Miss Olivia?
I like her beret and her that girl hair.
Well, a beret, it's not unlike Olivia herself, actually. Let's get a handle on what's said about these Laplanders, shall we? This is a very early report on the Laplanders. The Laplanders have a reputation for magical practice, which is almost proverbial throughout Europe, and certainly so among the peoples of the Scandinavian peninsula. Indeed, the Finns still credit them with extraordinary power in sorcery and divination. Scheffler, in his Laponia, 1674 is when the book comes from, writing of Lap magic, says, quote, "The melancholic constitution of the Laplanders renders them subject to frightful apparitions and dreams, which they look upon as infallible presages made to them by the genius of what is to befall them." That's a long way, a 16th, 17th century way of saying they could predict things in the future. And there's this whole thing about the Laplander's drum and how it's a kind of an interface between here and another world. So basically, that's how they put themselves, they attune themselves and put them into this state. A little more dealing with the Laplanders. And one of the things I want to reference about the Laplanders while we're still talking about, I want to try to match up these thoughts. The Laplanders, Aura Reigns, and this next story I'm about to tell you. Let's see if we can string all these together and have a little better handle on what's going on with these agencies and who they're using. This is a real story. Came out of the Miami Herald in 1972. It was the same year. It relates to President Nixon. And it's the same year that Robert Merritt, who's a whistleblower, came on this show and told us about the time capsule relating to UFO File disclosure that Nixon was preparing and had told him about, and had him deliver a copy to Henry Kissinger. Okay, so the story, there's the headline for you. Nixon's housekeeper shoplifted in trance. That's a pretty good, it's a pretty racy title. Nixon's housekeeper shoplifted in trance. Now, actually, it's interesting that they call her housekeeper. She was actually an administrative assistant, but it was at his Florida White House, basically, when you go down there. Quote from the Miami Herald: a part-time housekeeper at President Nixon's Key Biscayne retreat has testified she was put in a hypnotic daze by a stranger who told her to shoplift 4 dresses. Shirley Cromartie, 32, and a mother of 3, pleaded no contest and was given a suspended sentence after law enforcement officers and a psychiatrist testified they believed she was telling the truth. Mrs. Cromartie holds a security clearance to work in the Florida White House, according to testimony. She said she met a woman in a parking lot and asked her the time. By the way, Keel says, for some reason, these Men in Black cases, they always ask the victim the time. What time is it? Before they hypnotize them and do the whole shebang. So here she's playing right along with it. But it's a woman. A woman met her in the parking lot and asked her the time, then ordered her to take the items and bring them to her. That is, go get those 4 dresses and bring them to me. Mrs. Cromartie testified she fell into a daze when the young woman released a jasmine-like scent from her left hand. She was told to take the dresses for her children, Mrs. Cromartie said. In court, this is what Cromartie quoted. This is what her quote was. I just sort of lost my will. It was a terrifying experience. She told Metro Court Judge Frederick Barad. The mysterious woman was described as young, attractive, and wearing a wig. Judge Barad said, this is all so bizarre. I agree with you, Judge, that I'm frightened at what could happen to the president. It's also a weird thing to say. What do you think of that?
This is the craziest story.
I mean, I'm frightened at what could happen to the president? Okay, I mean, the Secret Service is there. What's the problem? Mrs. Cromartie joined the Key Biscayne White House housekeeping staff about a year previously. According to an FBI agent, Leo McLaren, he testified her background was impeccable. Dr. Albert Jaslaw, psychiatrist, said he examined her and found she could be hypnotized quickly and easily, and found she was telling the truth. Easy hypnosis subject. Or Reigns. XProtect. You know, there are factors here. It's interesting with Nixon, too, because in 1972, he's contemplating, in 1975, putting out this new alternative energy source through the work at Pine Gap and keeping a time capsule in the White House relating to the UFO file and the incredible technology that will make America self-sustaining energy-wise. It's too close, probably, to XProtect, which is probably where the story comes from. The story makes no sense, but for people who could understand it, that is, the people in that Nixon security fold, they'd have a much better handle on it. They would understand the message.
Do you think it was a message sent to Nixon?
Oh, absolutely. Why bother hanging out and messing with his assistant? Doesn't make any sense. No. Certainly, it's very close. But a couple of things there that are interesting. The jasmine, I think, is very interesting. The wig, of course, tells us a lot. And the instant hypnotic trance. Those are all qualities that if you track through our friend John Keel's work, these are the types of things that he runs across. So I think we're getting a much better handle on what these things represent, who they are, instead of just, well, some mysterious men in black and all the rest of it. They're fragments. It's kind of like projections. Whoever they are masters at the skills that the mystery schools possess. Hypnosis, transformation. They take on that kind of Apotheum thing. They disappear at times. They go into one room and then nobody can find them again. So yeah, it sounds like magic, but we're getting into that whole astral agency idea. It's starting to make more sense now. I start to feel that it makes more sense. Okay. And then, I'm going to go bring us back to Parsons for a minute. Remember, that's what the foundation there of NASA, JPL, doing his engaging with the mystery tradition of the Golden Dawn. We have to get that. When we run across things like the groups that work at NASA and the kind of occult symbology that they use, everything is going to make a lot more sense to us when we understand the tools that they use. Not that we can imagine or go into this imaginative state where we see everything that they do is some kind of occult trick, but we have to understand that that there are high-level people dealing with these things. It's on record. Even the story that I just read to you is foundational information for the types of abilities that these people possess. Yes.
Just something interesting. Yep. Gregory Good says the jasmine-like scent hypnosis sounds like the Brugmansia seed powder that is being used in Brazil to drug tourists and get them to obey whoever drugged them. Yes.
Wow, that stuff is absolutely amazing. Yeah. But again, when you're dealing with drugs, I think that's one aspect, So she's obviously doing this combination factor where the jasmine is kind of this pleasant thing, and then boom, you're in her control. It's quite remarkable because think of what a great job this was. Can you imagine? I mean, working for Nixon as his assistant in Florida, this is it's incredibly high level. To have it get flushed down the drain by this bizarre happening and then probably be presented as a security risk for the rest of your life. Unbelievable. And with that, I have more that I'm going to roll into this, but I'm going to roll over the questions to you.
Okay. All right.
Olivia.
Okay. Well, I think you should, for me, yes. Would you just bring up Dan Aykroyd?
He's coming.
He's coming?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I can, we definitely can. Of course, Dan Aykroyd has his incredible Men in Black experience. Let's take a look at Dan. Dan's from around here, actually. I think he was born in the same town as I was. But Dan Aykroyd, of course, the truly amazing SNL actor. And what's our favorite Dan Aykroyd movie? Let's think about it. Trading Places, I guess.
Undoubtedly.
Valentine. But there has to be, no one, I think, who's on the scene of that whole celebrity world that is closer to the UFO interest. This is a guy who's followed it his whole life. He knows the ins and outs of it. As a matter of fact, he had his own sighting when he was living in upstate New York with his beautiful wife, Donna Dixon. And I actually met Donna Dixon, Dan Aykroyd, and Paul Schaefer coming out of a House of Blues.
I forgot about that.
And it was quite an experience, too. And they were definitely dazzling in person. But the interesting thing about Dan is that he came forward on the UFO thing. It's almost like you see this happen with people sometime, and I see this happening with Jim Carrey a little bit right now. They have this career, and they're out there and boom, and then their career kind of goes quiet a little bit, and they're starting to bring out their other interests, and they can really shine there. Now, Aykroyd had these, like early experiences of being very interested in the topic, and then when he was older, he had these sightings. But what was really fascinating is he decided to work on a program for our friends at Sci-Fi Channel. And I think the program is called Out There, but I'll confirm that. Anyway, as it turns out, Out There was a series of 10 episodes dealing with all these different cases that were his favorite cases, whether it was Travis Walton or things along this line. And he was working with the Sci-Fi Channel on it, and they had actually shot 8 of the 10. And the classic story about it is that he was going into the Sci-Fi building. This is so funny because he's on the phone with
Britney Spears.
Oh boy, toxic. She is so toxic. That's her big song right there. I'm not dissing her. So there is this kind of fascinating thing that happens there where he's like, I'm on the phone with Britney Spears, and I turn around and there's a weird man in black there, and he has like a 1940s car, and he's all in a black suit with shiny shoes and the whole rest of it, and he is looking at him like he wants to just stare a hole through him, and then he disappears. Now, you might say, oh, it's a promotion or whatever, but no, he told the story years later. And what happens is he goes up to the office at the Sci-Fi Channel, and they say, the show's been canceled. It's not going to go out. And all the work that you did, we're going to keep. And you're out. No explanation. Zip. It's really strange. Yeah, because you think about the money that got spent making the shows. Then you think about...
They didn't even release it to DVD.
Yeah,
I mean, it's still unavailable.
Right. I've never seen it. Now, he has done some other specials, thank God. But whatever he was tapping into, there's obviously something there. And again, this is classic XProtect, because we would say, oh, it's the Men in Black, and like, you know, people would think of the movie or something like that. By the way, I've never seen the Men in Black movies. But, you know, if you really look at the situation, it's quite unusual. Here's a major public figure interfacing directly with XProtect. And they're pulling his show. Like, it happens in real time in the real world. They pull his show. I mean, this is a very interesting thing to consider. And he's never backed off that story once. And he seems genuinely freaked out by it. But the deal is, he's a high-profile figure. He moved into this area of opening up the UFO file. And he was kind of a loose cannon. I mean, because he's already a celebrity. He's hard to control. If they have certain things in the UFO file that they don't want you to touch upon, if they want to keep a certain narrative about it, you know, we might attribute that and say, well, you know, the Air Force, you know, or the CIA, they don't want these truths to get out. True. But the CIA can't show up and blink out. And as we know, in relation to how the Men in Black operate, they look, everything is spotless and shiny and all the rest of it, but they look like they came out of 1950. And very often the cars that they drive, although they are brand new and over again, we were watching the UFO Hunters last night from 2009 that had, I forget that singer's name, but he was there and he had a weird experience in the desert with these guys. And they had one of these really old 1948 classic cars, but it looked spotless, like it was brand new. And their clothing was like that. And they came over and talked to him about his UFO sighting. So it's quite unusual. They seem to be coming out of a time period. And I'm going to go, before we're done, I'm going to touch, I have one more quote about the Laplanders, which, Olivia, you're going to clue me in on. But let's work some questions in on this and really throw it out there for people. You're watching Dark Journalists. We're going deep into XProtect, and it's only going to get deeper from here. But, you know, it's funny because with the Men in Black aspect, there's almost like, you know, it's like half terrifying, half humorous, but when you get to XProtect, that whole cycle makes a lot more sense, because it's not the over commercialized bit. It's actually those people dealing with it were absolutely intimidated by it. And Keel, you know, something interesting about him is he would find over and over again, he kept showing up when these people had just left. And he was like, damn, I cannot catch them. Every time I hear about them and I never catch them. Then he would go back to his hotel room and they would call him in this weird robotic voice and say, what did you see at the, you know, investigation site or whatever it was? And they knew everything that he was up to. So they're definitely actual, but he was convinced also that it was not a government program. So where does that leave us? We have to look at the roots of what the mystery schools have given us for understanding to understand that. If you understand theosophy, for example, you understand your astral body, you understand your ethereal body, you understand people's ability to astral project. This is where so many of those things came from. And, you know, where so many books were like astral projection were so big in the 60s. That whole renaissance came about through theosophy and anthroposophy and those groups. They're giving us the tools to understand what's going to come. And if we don't have those tools, then it becomes a much murkier situation. How would you like to be round and round in a whirlpool of what I call 2 minutes hate on YouTube, where you get to hate political figures for 2 minutes by your favorite host, and then you don't get to the real core of what's happening. You just go round and around hating these people. Look at this whole week that we've had that just went on with Kavanaugh and all that. I mean, you know, we're really looking at a situation where we need to lift our consciousness up against the things that are being drowned into it, basically. That's my 2 cents on it. Okay, go for it.
Okay. All right. So Lunatux wants to know, is Trump aware of XProtect? What is his relationship with them, or is he an enemy of XProtect? And Bo Krill said Trump's uncle was XProtect.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I'll tell you why. Trump's uncle, John Trump, is a brilliant physicist, engineer. He's the one they call in, as we have 2 episodes. Tesla Trump and the Time Capsule is the one that I recommend first, and then the other Tesla Trump one. That'll give you the foundation. Look, I try to show this picture in every episode. Look at that picture. You have Donald Trump with Richard Nixon, and in the middle is John Connally. Governor John Connally, who was in the car when Kennedy was assassinated. Now, when you're Nixon and you're a politician, you understand, like Connally does, that everything is about your visual image. So here they're saying Nixon is standing with the man who was assassinated, the man who was in the car when Kennedy was assassinated, and Trump is here. Here's kind of a weird line of precedency, if you think about it. I can't really see Nixon's face there. Well, that's a little better. But I think you get the idea, which is Nixon was taken out ultimately, in my opinion, by this group for his plans to release that technology that resided in the UFO file. By the way, he ran CIA Blue Book in the 50s. So he understood all that. Project Blue Book, the stuff, the junk that we get, it's like TTSA. To the Stars Academy and Tom DeLonge is the same type of CIA op. And I will say this, they put out their financials today and people are talking about it and they have to go deeper on it. But I can tell you something, they're claiming a $37 million loss, okay, from the work that they're doing. You know, first of all, that kind of money, you know, what are they doing? Flooding the alternative media with social media ads? I mean, $37 million. It gets stranger and stranger. And there's a comment there in the SEC filing where the SEC person looking at it says, we don't know if this corporation is sustainable. Yeah. It's starting to look a lot like a CIA money laundering operation that's just there to tilt the UFO story in one direction or another. So, you know, I really, To the Stars Academy, one of the most bizarre, I think, activities we've seen on the intelligence side trying to invade the UFO question. Okay. By the way, that is Connolly there, who we just showed standing with Trump in the assassination car. Just about, this is actually 12 or 13 seconds before the assassination. So, he was right there in the heart of it and took a bullet, as we know. So he's somebody who, when we find Trump's first kind of entree into the political world is standing with him and Nixon became his good friend, as we've demonstrated in this show. I think we have to kind of take a cue from all this. Now, we're talking about John Trump, and the question was, does he, is Trump about XProtect? Well, John Trump, having been close to Vannevar Bush is his mentor. Vannevar Bush controls the UFO file. So therefore, John Trump knows about the UFO file. Therefore, his nephew, who he's close to and shares secrets with, as Trump has told us over and over again. Trump just mentioned his uncle in the UK last month, talking about how close they were. Yes, is the answer. Trump has that information. However, remember, there's two ops going on there. One is the Podesta Hillary op with Elizondo and DeLong. That's all out. WikiLeaks released all that. So that's the UFO push that they wanted to do, which is the phony threat in outer space that we need a defense thing for. So it was all threat. Remember that. AATIP also has the word threat in it, right? So that's where they're coming from. And I haven't shown this in a while. Might as well show it. That is, let's see. Well, that's Nixon's letter to Donald Trump with his signature. And what it says is, Mrs. Nixon told me you were great on the Donahue shows. You can imagine she's an expert on politics, and she predicts when you decide to run for office, you'll be a winner. That's 1987. And that's from 26 Federal Plaza, New York City. Richard Nixon moved to New York City and became close friends with Donald Trump. Nixon was the ultimate insider in the political scene. Where does Trump get all of his inside information from? How did he get there? How did he completely roll the dice on the election and beat the odds, as it were? Well, he knew the machine. Who taught him? Well, a lot of people say Roy Cohn taught him, fine, but still, Cohn wouldn't have, I don't think, the kind of information that Nixon had. So Nixon is definitely the key there. If you want to understand Trump, you got to understand Nixon. Okay.
All right. Mayan Taurus. Is Elon Musk being targeted?
Yes, absolutely. Musk is a very strange aspect. It's almost like, I almost feel like Musk decided he wanted to play along and they positioned him in a certain way. We're going to do a whole show on Musk, but Musk is not playing along so much anymore, and they just want to get him out. There's a new story that just came out about how he's being sued by the government, and he did some weird things. What is this? The curse of the Joe Rogan show. Anyone who goes on there acts bizarro. Maybe smoking pot and trying to do a real interview is not such a hot idea. Smoke pot when you're home and you want to do your own thing, but don't do it if you're doing an interview in public and it's important. When he got back, they sank the stock something like $40 billion. I mean, it's incredible. It was incredibly disastrous interview, as Tom DeLonge had an incredibly disastrous interview. So Rogan, it's kind of bad luck for those guys. And the way that I look at it, it's like, I mean, keep your wits when you're talking about important things. Here's another weird thing I want to mention about Musk. Musk is talked all about the threats of artificial intelligence, and I agree with him 100%. Actually, we're going to do a whole transhumanist show coming up, which is absolutely crucial for us, and we work on that a lot. But I will say this. Musk said, well, since nobody believed me, now I'm creating something called Neuralink, which can hoist your consciousness into this machine, And it's just the most idiotic transhumanist thing that he's saying now, So these guys, if you understand anything about mystery schools, the first thing they teach you about is what? Your endocrine system and your gland system, like the pineal gland and all the rest of it. You cannot upload your consciousness into a machine. And any attempts to do that basically is like a short circuit thing. You are a complete spiritual chakra system. So really, ideas for doing that are kind of a trick, more or less. Okay, you're up.
Okay, so what do you think about Bill Cooper being targeted?
Well,
It's a hard one.
Cooper's a really interesting story. I will say this about Cooper, who's a controversial figure. He came up and talked in depth, in an intelligent way, about XProtect style aspects long before anybody did. He was talking about the whole MJ12 aspect really early on with a good degree of knowledge. And I don't think anyone really knows where he got that knowledge. He claims that because he wrote down that he was a Mason, that they thought he was basically one of their insiders and that they gave him all this information when he was in the Navy. They're very unusual stories, and certainly, you know, there's a lot of flaws in all of that. But I think when he came out with his book, I heard something which is kind of interesting, and I've gotten some pretty good sources on it, which is that the only two books that are banned in U.S. prisons are his book and David Icke's book. So it's kind
What
of
does that tell you?
Well, they definitely don't want you thinking about overlords. I guess that's kind of the takeaway. Okay, you're up.
Okay, so Titan-blooded, was L. Ron Hubbard assassinated by XProtect?
Well, Hubbard is a very, very tricky story. And I think what he did literally was he worked off the occult knowledge that he had, and he created this whole Scientology thing based around information that he had gleaned. But he has great knowledge of the mystery schools, and he brought together, he kind of tried to create what I'm going to call with Scientology a kind of fake mystery school, and inserted this alien aspect into it, which was kind of smart because it seemed to update the whole thing. And we saw a lot of groups do that, where they took Theosophy and suddenly injected the UFO aspect into it. Quite remarkable. But who can blame them? Because, you know, I mean, we had a whole wave there of kind of people taking the mystery school information to the next step that was public. And again, when these things go public, you know, it's anybody's ballgame. Certainly, there's a huge confluence between, it's kind of the root of the X Steganography, between the UFO file, as we know it now, and the X Steganography, the mystery schools. Those things do come together.
This is just a comment. Jack Ryan said Scientology is MK Ultra on steroids from experience.
Hey, listen, I'll tell you something. If you try to publish that, you're going to get some, if you think about XProtect, you're going to get some Scientology people after you. I remember some publishers that I spoke with, and the publisher, he recently passed away, actually. But he's Elena Freeland's publisher. It's Feral House, and it's Adam at Feral House. Yeah, he passed away maybe about 6 months ago. And one of the stories he told me, which was remarkable, was about when he put an anti-Scientology bit in one of his compendium books with various editors, and how they came after him and followed him and took pictures of him and did all these different things. So there's something very, very unusual about the Scientology group, and I've never had a whole lot of patience for it. There's a little aura rains for you. Keep us in the XProtect zone. Okay. Oh, by the way, before we go any further, I thought you'd find this interesting too. It's sort of a side note, but let's throw it in real quick. This is somebody who was writing for the Institute for Advanced Study in the early 50s, and he kept going after Einstein. Go on the record about UFOs. Tell us what you know. Give us something, anything. And we know that Einstein was involved with Project Invisible, which is remembered as the Philadelphia experiment. And there's quite an interesting history there with Einstein. But here's his actual response. There's the letter, and there's the guy he sent it to. And this is July 1952. So really getting exhausted at this guy sending letters. He writes, "Dear Sir, these people have seen something underlined. What it is, I do not know, and I am not curious to know." So the guy who gives you E equals MC square is not curious about the greatest mystery.
Right. And his
on the
big
planet.
comment is about imagination being more important than intelligence, but he's not curious.
Let's me read that again. These people have seen something. What it is, I do not know, and I am not curious to know. Signed, Albert Einstein, the greatest scientist of the 20th century.
Other than Tesla.
So basically, well, I mean, accepted, forget it. Tesla was way ahead of all of them. But let's face it, you know, once you take it to that extent, you know, then I think we get a pretty good idea of what's going on. What's fascinating to me is that he doesn't want to deal with XProtect. I don't blame him. He's too high profile a scientist. If he gets involved with the UFO file where they're hiding the X technology, you know, it's goodbye legacy and career. You become like Robert Sarbarker, who you can't even get a Wikipedia page. Who's the top physicist. He was like Oppenheimer. He worked with Oppenheimer. Why isn't there a Wikipedia page for Robert Sarbarker? Think about that. Olivia, what is it you pointed out? There's a Wikipedia page for one of the dwarfs in Wizard of Oz. I mean, let's get real. Okay.
Okay. So Titan-blooded again. How far back does XProtect go? Did it originate in the mystery schools? And Lunatux wants to know, do you see XProtect as connected to the Belial group all the way down through the centuries?
Yeah, it does. I'll tell you an interesting thing. I want you to internalize and externalize what I'm talking about. I want you to think about yourself and how you have your own secrets that you're trying to learn about the world, and how you have your own mechanisms for secrecy. You have, in essence, your own XProtect built in. And you have your quest for truth. You know, you have these different sides inside of you, all of them. So then on the surface, what we see are these groups who do these things and try to keep a wall of secrecy around the advancement of the society for technological reasons, spiritual reasons, because it's trying to maintain a kind of control and to harvest the population and maintain a power base. If we get into Steiner's work, for example, he calls it the Ahrimanic force. That's really, you know, the core of what it's all about. So when you go back there into that antediluvian period, the terms may change a little bit, but they have their version of it. I think it's kind of a, as long as you're a human being, you're going to be dealing with something that is maintaining secrecy away from you. And so when we get into that, I think we understand a little bit better if we start to think to ourselves, you know, how people operate with secrecy. You know, if somebody has personal secrets and or tells a white lie or whatever it happens to be, you can see it all through that prism. When you look at a group like XProtect, like I said, it has its normal political function. So think of that as like the destruction of Jim Garrison is a good example. That's XProtect on overdrive. We've seen them do it, actually. I want to show you a special example of XProtect, the political side, because I have talked a lot about the mystical side of XProtect, and it's deep. Here's the political side of XProtect. Do you remember the governor of Arizona during the Phoenix Lights?
5 Symington.
Exactly.
1997.
5 Symington. So do you remember the date for the Phoenix Lights, which was this massive sighting when people were out looking for an asteroid of this large, and I mean large, craft hovering over Phoenix?
If you don't know about the Phoenix Lights, then you don't belong here.
Or you're going to find out.
March 13th?
March 13th, 1997. Ah, yes, I remember it well. September 4th, 1997. Let's read a New York Times headline. Arizona governor convicted of fraud and will step down. The governor of Arizona during the Phoenix Lights, which happened in, Olivia?
I'm sorry, missed it?
Just give me the date of the...
March 13th, 1997.
Beautiful. And the date of this article is September 4th. So go March 13th, 1997, Phoenix Lights happened. What happens in between? Something really, really strange happens in between. This is not a joke. You might remember this too. Right? This is the governor giving a really, really, really weird press conference where he has someone dress up as a gray. And they say,
it's like his press secretary or something.
Yeah. Well, he's taking him to trial. Okay. I mean, it's quite unusual. So this is the nature of what's going on there with 5 Symington. How strange was this story? Now, at first, he ridiculed it and said, oh, there was nothing. However, there's a third part to this. 5 Symington, ready? Former governor of Arizona. This is Express UK newspaper. Aliens came to my state in UFO during Phoenix Lights. There he is. So somewhere between March, when the sighting happened, and June, when the press conference ridiculing the whole incident happened, and September, where he was facing the slammer and had to be removed as governor, he wasn't playing ball anymore, apparently. I mean, that's the way I read it. And later, he's like, you know what? You put me through the ringer, you put me through the coals. I'm not going to keep my silence anymore. And voila, there he is saying, yep, it was a UFO that visited my state. This guy was considered presidential material before all this happened. This basically sunk his career. That's XProtect. Whatever it was, he started by playing ball, and then he wasn't playing ball over the Phoenix Lights. Phoenix Lights, probably the best modern day case, say, within the past. It's about 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. He was presiding over it. What happens to the person presiding over the sighting as governor? He faces jail, and then later he says, aliens came to my state in UFO during Phoenix Lights. You know, so that, if you want that snapshot, that's a good one. I would also say that Morris Jessup faced the same problem, and he put out the case for the UFO in 56. Too much information, too close to the UFO file. 59, he's found on the highway, carbon monoxide poisoning. So extreme measures here, kind of extreme measures with 5 Symington. But that's XProtect action. And it's the straight up kind of political hit job type. And this was just an assassination hit, CIA style. So dealing much more, there's political, there's the political end of what they do with XProtect, and there's the Astral agency. And you learn to identify them. Okay.
I guess Greer said that he was responsible for bringing the aliens for the Phoenix Lights. Did you know that?
And there's an awful lot of self-promotion that goes on related to Greer.
If that's true, then why hasn't it happened again, I would say. If he has that kind of power and influence.
You know, it's interesting. I have an open letter from John Keel about UFO researchers, and it really applies to this. So I'm going to grab it real quick. Let's see. It's pretty interesting, too, because I think what we're experiencing over and over again is human infighting, like human frailties, that kind of thing, over and over. And really, for my money, I mean, it's a totally... it's kind of a lowest common denominator thing when people pump up and say, I'm so responsible for this, I'm responsible for that. That's not how you get at the truth in relation to this stuff. As a matter of fact, it's quite a study. You have to be ready to really study like crazy to get a handle on it. So my advice would be forget about Greer and all that kind of stuff. Get into understanding who the mystery schools are and get into understanding what the X Steganography means related to secrecy now. That'll give you a much better picture than somebody saying, I'm bringing on the aliens. I'm always leery of that kind of thing.
Yeah, okay. You can tell the story of the insight that I had around
Tell me, yeah.
Stephen Greer. You remember we were watching the video of them trying to bring the aliens in?
Yes, this is classic. Yeah.
And he's like, do it.
No. Well, it's funny because Olivia pointed this out. He's like, open your hearts, and I mean, I'm not saying Greer hasn't done good work, so, but this was really rough. So it's like, open your hearts, get your head down, you're in the shot, get down. It's like, open your hearts, everybody, like, get your head down. So yeah, really, that's really advanced there. Thank you, Greer. And then he has that app where you're supposed to use the app and call down, it's, I don't know, like, what state do you have to be in to play that game? I mean, we saw, was it Jim Acosta, and he had to do a whole, oh my God, he had to do a whole CNN segment on Trump's penis. Okay. And this is CNN. How much money, Anderson Cooper, right? Born a Rothschild, bred by the CIA out of college. They put him into CNN to say anything that they want him to say. And at a certain point, he has to talk about condoms and Stormy Daniels. I mean, how much money, are you just going to, if you can't call the shots over your own life, you're not worth anything. So if that's what you're going to cover, that's what a reporter is going to cover, Stormy Daniels? Come on. All right. Well, that was good.
Okay.
From Greer to Anderson Cooper to Stormy Daniels, we got them all.
Julie Smith said that Norman Berggren was poisoned also, but he lived.
Oh.
But also he was blackballed, and he has no Wikipedia page.
Oh, he was no doubt blackballed and very hard to find any of his stuff. He was an incredible character there. And oddly enough, his book now, The Ringmakers of Saturn, that is what they used, basically that report that they used to scare the bejesus out of Reagan. And what did Reagan do? He ordered SDI Star Wars, which was, as soon as he did it, he was able to say, you know what? Let's get rid of all our nukes too. How about a zero option? And he offered the Soviet Union to eliminate all nuclear weapons. So Russia and America were going to get together and get rid of the nukes. Didn't happen, but they did agree to the first real hardcore reductions of the period. And they got the whole situation kind of down and under control. But SDI was the major kind of factor in all that. And SDI didn't go anywhere. We continued to grow SDI. And now we have the space fence coming at you thanks to United States of Lockheed Martin. Okay.
I've a great point brought up here by Armando Solorzano. Pat Price was killed for remote viewing underground bases.
Wow, excellent point.
Yep.
Pat Price was a sheriff who learned of Russell Targ's program. I have a two-part interview with Russell Targ, who's the head of the remote viewing program at SRI, and worked with some of the best psychics like Uri Geller and all the rest of it. And Pat Price was unique, though, because he used his psychic ability in order to track different criminals and different people. And he would get that psychic hit. So he used it in that. And then when they brought him in for remote viewing, he was so good. But then at a certain point, he got interested in this UFO subject. And he died in a very unusual fashion, again, in a kind of poisoned situation in a hotel in Las Vegas.
What was the circumstance around that? Didn't somebody bump into him?
What he told his I think it was his son, just before he died, was that somebody, when I went through the hotel lobby, somebody went round and around with me, and then we're like, oh, I'm sorry, I missed you. So they did that little...
Didn't he feel a prick in his...
No, but they found one.
Oh.
Yeah, they found one. And so it was like a needle mark, and they could not figure out exactly what had caused him, and that he was in this very unusual position, sort of like on his knees on a bed with his arms out.
Oh, right.
And, so we get into some really tricky territory. But remember, Stansfield Turner, who was the CIA director in the 70s, when he learned about those programs when he came in, he told his assistant they're black, 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 black. So let's keep that in mind. Okay.
Did you get into that? The kid in the restaurant story? The son... I didn't hear you tell it. The son in the restaurant.
Oh wow, that's a piece of the Maury Island. Well, keep cruising. I'll bring it in. All right.
So
basically, in a nutshell, what Olivia is alluding to. It's so interesting. Basically, in the Maury Island case, the guy who reports the case, Harold Dahl, and this is in Ken Thomas's book on it. Harold Dahl reports it, and then these men in black come in and they say, we don't want you to talk about the slag that burned your dog and killed your dog and burns your son's arm that came off of these weird donut UFOs, because this guy was living in a boat. And so what happened was that they were like, you know, sign this disclaimer basically saying the whole thing was a hoax and you're off the hook. And they were these weird men in black kind of intimidated dudes. And as it turns out, he was like, no way. And what happened was his son disappeared. His son was 15. 3 months later, they found the son working at a resort on the coast, I think in California. And he was completely brainwashed in this trance. He was a dishwasher in a country club. And there he was, just completely drawing a blank on what had happened, how he was there or whatever. He was just getting up and going to sleep, and somebody had sort of placed him in there. And so Dahl signed that statement saying the whole thing was a hoax, and that's what's on the record now. So you see, XProtect can influence history very easily. People look back on that case and they say, didn't so-and-so say that was a hoax or whatever? Just like when I've told the story about the Fox sisters in the early mystery school work, when they came out, they were the first spiritualists, really. And people say later, you know, didn't one of the Fox sisters say it was all a hoax, you know? And the whole thing is the environment, the mystery schools work on these people. They don't want these things out. One half of the mystery schools, the other half does. So they try to create this narrative that it's not happening, and they kind of pressure somebody into a situation where, you know, they have to discredit themselves. So those are tactics, and they work all up and down the chain. But yes, wow. The dishwasher thing I thought was interesting because, you know, they took the son as kind of, you know, it was ransom in a sense because they had placed him in this job. But the absolute mental control he was under, you know, we think of MK Ultra and things like that. When you get up to XProtect, you know, like Nixon's housekeeper who shoplifted in a trance, we're in a different ballgame. That's astral. Those abilities are like mystery school abilities.
I mean, he was pretty much like a zombie.
Yeah. Well, the non-memory part, you know, someone was talking about that drug where you don't remember anything. Mm-hmm. That's kind of like what it was like. Absolutely fascinating questions. You are watching, I'll remind you, Dark Journalist. We only have about 10 minutes left, so we're going to take the best questions we got. Olivia's going to give it her best shot.
Yes.
Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. It's fantastic to have you. We're getting pretty deep on XProtect, but I think XProtect has been under the radar a long time, and we need to kind of hammer away at exactly what it is that we're dealing with in those cases. What is that history that people like Keel brought forward, tracking the men in black? Or the women in black, or as we've shown here tonight, there's certainly a female influence in it. Smacks a lot more of the mystery schools, in my opinion, of these groups getting their hands on the same types of abilities that the mystery schools have. And so I will remind you to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter. That keeps us in touch. That's going to be very key going forward, as we know how unstable these social media platforms are. We have incredible things coming up for you for October. So you want to make sure you're on there. Subscribe actually to the site. You're going to get more information coming up related to the X series. I'm going to do special things for subscribers, but the first big benefit you'll get is Catherine Austin Fitts' 1 hour overview of the secret system of finance and technology. I'm putting that out in a couple of days. So that's something that you're definitely going to want. Become a member. We've made it so easy for you. Do that at Dark Journalist. Get behind the things that are important. You know, I looked around as I was doing this work on XProtect, and I was thinking of this HBO special that I was doing with Olivia and Alexandra and Susan Manowich last year around this time for the Kennedy assassination. And I was looking at these people and thinking to myself, my God, look at the people that we have, you know. Alexandra's from Brown University, you know. We have Catherine Austin Fitts, who was a partner at Dillon Reed and the Secretary of HUD. I mean, we have amazing people. Do we really need to talk about like blue chickens and galactic ambassadors and all the junk that swirls around the independent? Let's get to the good stuff. We've got the best people. Let's get to a whole different level working on this. Susan Manowich, New Energy Movement, and all the incredible things. We're going to have her come back on the show. You know, these are the people. Let's get behind the good stuff. We've had enough malarkey. You know, I was talking to Olivia earlier today, and not to be mean, but like, you know, they have that commercial 1-800-JUNK, or what is it?
Got junk.
Got junk.
Oh.
I would just, you know, let's have a junk truck pull up and just, you know, Gaia TV, slam that junk in there, Blue Chickens, TTSA, CIA operation, just roll that stuff out of here, bring in a whole new breath of fresh air. We have the legacy. We stand on the shoulders of incredible work like the Anthroposophical Society, like Theosophy, and like these very important movements that have happened and really set us up for something much, much better. And we have the people. This is the thing. So it's up to us. You know, what are we going to choose? Okay, we're choosing. And when you guys choose Dark Journalists, when you support the show and you get behind it, it moves that ball forward. And that's what we're doing here.
Yes. Okay. So Larvey Coswald is wondering whether XProtect is also present in the astral realm.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's its more natural state, and I would say possibly its more dangerous state. But there's astral influencers. I always think about Steiner talking about certain secrets that the mystery schools let out through people like him, and how he was pressured to give away certain types of information relating to the eighth sphere. And he said, the minute that I would give away something relating to this, I would be under such incredible psychic attack that it would take all of my energy deflecting it. So, and that was an inside thing too. It wasn't like a big dramatic public statement, but that's the way you have to think about it. They operate, the whole XProtect idea certainly operates on an astral level. And we find those people who are really sensitive. I have to bring this up, which is, there is a video out there, if you go to Gigi Young's channel, about her own encounter with the Men in Black situation. And it is fascinating. We talked about it at length, and Gigi really had a powerful experience there. And I think, you know, as we get into Gigi's story and her background, we're really, you know, it is someone that those types of group take an interest in. And so I think, again, we have incredible people to bring forward and to bring forward their incredible work. And, you know, I think the best kind of block and deflection and shield against XProtect type activity is being aware of it. And people like Gigi really help us do that. Okay.
Okay. How does Ahriman figure into this?
Well, Ahriman's kind of like in the anthroposophical cosmology, Ahriman is the lower astral force, and he is woven up in the technology. So, you know, we like technology. I was a tech editor for years, so and worked with Apple and all the rest of it. But the thing is, the technology at the point that they're pushing it on, where, you know, they're talking about Amazon now is going to get rid of, they're going to open 300 stores that don't have cashiers and things like that. They want to take the human part out of it, and they can use things like, hey, it's going to be, you know, more productive or whatever. But a lot of it too is that there's the move towards transhumanism, and in the transhumanism field, you move on their levels of the tree of life from the animal to the mineral, and you're a next step up. They understand the rules around the tree of life, the Kabbalah, and all the rest of it, just like any spiritual mystery school person would. So what they're shooting for is just going up around it without doing any of the spiritual development. They're ready to shoot themselves up. So part of this is, if I get up to this mineral level, oh, I'm away from that animal level, and I can keep moving into this thing and like project my consciousness into these robots and all the rest of it and control the world. So that's the whole Ray Kurzweil thing. It's not going to end nicely for them, I think, in the grand scheme of things, but wow.
Did Steiner ever talk about Ahriman being present in on other planetary systems? Is he just ours?
No, I mean, he is part of our creation in this system. It's definitely system specific.
Let me just explain where I'm going here. So, you know, it has been said that there are good aliens and bad aliens that are visiting us here. And I guess we would say the good ones are more humanistic. They want us to evolve. And the bad ones are more mechanistic. You would say more Ahrimanic. Is it possible that their home planets, wherever they come from, were already overtaken by transhumanism and Ahriman, and they've expanded in the universe and they've come here to do the same, like the Borg?
Well, this is fascinating. You're getting into a lot of interesting territory there. I like that a lot. What I would say is this. This is how we should look at it. When I did work with the Transcenders, after finding out that they had made this incredible prediction for New York for October 13th, which is coming up, by the way, 2010, when this incident happened about a mass sighting over New York City. That's 8 years ago now. But one of the things that Rick Thurston, who was channeling the Transcenders, told me in relation to this was that this was exactly the nature of the situation, which is that some of these groups that were advanced had cloned themselves out of their original material, and that was one of the reasons for this incredible harvesting on planet Earth that was happening. Now, when that bigger picture of bringing in the aliens from other systems and things along this line, I think we do have to address it ultimately. But we need to get our bearing of the mystery here, which is the legacy of what the mystery schools have left us, in order to understand what's the whole UFO file aspect represents. It gives us a much better playing field to engage with what I would call peers. Too much is made on the whole alien track of alien saviors and all the rest of it, or alien demons, or, as my friends who are in Christian communities will really regard the alien idea as demonic, and they'll say, well, they're demons, they're fallen ones, and all the rest of it. It's also incorrect, in my opinion. The thing is, peers may be varying levels of technology, but peers certainly. It's a much better way to consider it. Remember this, when we talk about the UFO file and we talk about Apotheum, what they're talking about is something that upsets the nature. This is what the mystery schools hid. This is why we have X Steganography. It's why the mysteries are kept, because there's some grand secret about our existence. Fitz' great line, which is the main question to ask is, who are the powers on planet Earth and why are they acting the way that they're acting? My solution, my avenue rather, is that the X Steganography has something to do with that. So that's why we're moving into this understanding about it. The larger aspect that you're talking about, I think we've seen evidence for exactly what Olivia brought up, which is fascinating. But I guess focus-wise, and it does line up with what the Transcenders said, but what I would think is maybe we can get a better handle on what that is if we understand the message that the mystery schools left us. I guess that would be my less than concise answer, Miss Olivia.
So
Olivia's really on fire tonight, let's face it. These are great questions, and you're asking your own great questions.
So what is your opinion on the nature of the MIBs? Are they non-human? Are they biological androids? Could they be holograms? So far, what's your working hypothesis?
Yeah, well, you've got something really important going on here. John Keel's work isolated the fact that they looked like Laplanders. That's important. It's a breakthrough that's missed. It's been missed for decades. He actually reported that for the first time, I think, in '76. So we've got it. He's the guy who was on the ground dealing with them. He was there. They were calling him. And if you've ever seen the Mothman prophecies, they would give him a lot of information too when they called. A very unusual relationship that they had with him. But they have an unusual relationship. If you go back to that Point Pleasant thing that happened, you can kind of get a feel, even through figures like Indrid Cold, who showed up out of nowhere and was talking to this motorist on the highway about these incredible UFO realities, and all this kind of thing. And Indrid Cold was basically a very sharp man in black. And the person that he pulled over eventually came to a news station that night because other witnesses had seen this guy sitting on a highway with this parked craft. Very, very unusual situation.
Where was that?
West Virginia.
When was that?
66.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So,
didn't he hang out with the family afterwards or something like that?
Yes, there is a sequel, which is unfortunately Woody, the guy in question. I can't think of his last name, but he's a remarkable figure. He took a lot of heat for all of that, but his daughter came forward later in life, and she told us that Indrid Cold, in fact, took an interest in their family and was around when she was a kid. So
it's like a sitcom.
It is, yeah. He's my son. So yeah.
Well, if I remember correctly, the neighbors would come. Didn't they come by? Curious.
They were very curious that they were like, "Hey, there's like some spaceman hanging out there in a big limousine. What's happening?" It is a weird story. There's a lot of weird stories about it, but the thrust of it is, I believe, to answer your question, Keel is the person, and Frank Edwards. Those are the two people who understood the Men in Black aspect publicly. They spent the most time with it. Their conclusions were a little bit different, but Keel's ultimate conclusion was that it did not correspond to a government agency, that it corresponded to a very unusual kind of like extra, not extraterrestrial necessarily, but beyond human factor. And that they had the ability to zap in and zap out, and that they seem very out of place in this reality and time. Time's very important, and whenever all of the cases, the majority of the cases, actually, something like 8 out of the 10 cases, they would ask the question, what time is it? Which is a weird thing to ask. So this is part of the maybe bringing you into their realm of doing things. But they were known to show up there. If you go back in the earlier history, that's something that Keel tracked in stories in the Middle Ages, they would always show up in threes, just like the Men in Black did. It's quite unusual. And they would do things like basically be harbingers of bad omens and things along that line. I think that there's that whole kind of aspect of it. There's no question about it. There's some sort of imitative, not quite fully human aspect to what's happening there. So therefore, it's an astral type of experience that is very close to a physical experience. But other people see them, so it's like fully materialized. As I started the show off with, Ouspensky, the Russian philosopher working with Gurdjieff, who came out of the mystery schools, the Sarmoon Brotherhood, he said he could project and he could shapeshift and he could do all these things because he had learned that in the mystery schools. Somewhere they learned that. Now, it might be a kind of hypnosis also, but nonetheless, in terms of what they would visualize, they learned these abilities. So therefore, we understand that the Men in Black, instead of being some kind of magic thing, I mean, I guess it is magic from this point of view, but I would say that they are possessing the same skills that Ouspensky said that Gurdjieff possessed. And the Men in Black, now we have people from John Keel with all of his cases, but then there's people like Dan Aykroyd, I mean, it's unusual. I think it's something that we have to really open up to what's happening there, because just stories, I went back and I went through eras of stories of people writing about this all the way from 1950 to last year. And what I found was that, in general, it's a very misunderstood phenomena, and that, you can't get a handle on it unless you're thinking from a mystical point of view. So that's something to consider.
All right, let's do 2 final questions.
Excellent.
TJ Liberty Bell.
Okay.
DJ, what is the earliest reference we have of MIB?
Well, on the records, it's the Maury Island case. But as we were just talking about the Middle Ages, and, I mean, it's interesting because when you go back and look at those older stories, you wonder sometimes when you think about typical alien abduction stories and the stories of the changeling from the Middle Ages, they do seem remarkably similar. And when you get into the Fae realm and you're dealing with the She, and you're moving into that whole Tuatha which we have 2 shows, and we have a couple of shows coming up on the Tuatha then you start to kind of get a handle on it, because the Tuatha, as we described in the show that we did last month on them, you know, basically they were the holdover from the Atlantean period where the Apotheum took place that was so hidden in the Egyptian period. And these guys seem to still, they didn't get the memo from the mystery schools about hiding their abilities, and they would, you know, disappear and resurrect the dead and all this kind of thing. So I think we have to get a better handle on the nature of reality when we talk about the ancient cultures, the astral side of it, and how our ordinary everyday reality kind of interacts with that. But yeah, it's a journey. It's definitely a journey.
Okay, and Grandma Tippy Toes has the final question.
Grandma.
Do you think that level of secrecy will ever end?
Well, ever is an interesting word. No, not in our lifetime, and not in the foreseeable future. There's too much at stake with it. But I do think, in terms of the public society, in terms of culture, that the secrecy on the political level is at such an imbalance with what people know. So the people know it's a secret. So we have a schizophrenic cycle of disrespect going on between the leadership and the people. So that can end. And hopefully it ends without war. But my guess is that the larger picture that you're talking about comes about through the entire culture lifting up. That's a consciousness raising experience that translates into a physical reality. But there are forces. Look, when you try to get the truth about something relating to the UFO file, for example, you run the risk of running into XProtect. And XProtect certainly is dedicated to keeping the real secret on that whole Apotheum, X-Tech, invisibility, all that stuff, because that's the level that they're operating from. So they definitely are an astral arm of this whole thing. They want to keep that reality separate. Now, I think it's a worthy question. Is XProtect, the mystical side, related directly to the political side? We've seen the XProtect on the political side. My feeling is that the XProtect intelligence agency groups recruited people like the Laplanders, which what people have seen. And there are remarkable things about the Laplanders. In fact, I'm going to do a show just dedicated to them and their mystical abilities because of the things I'm finding out. By the way, incredible healing abilities as well. And I do have a quote about that, but Olivia, while I get it, you can ask the final question.
That was the final question, but I will do a couple shout outs.
Oh, yes.
We want to thank Jeanette for being a donor and making a big difference to the show. Thank you so much. We also wanted to say hello to Sarah, who is spending every Friday with us and adopting a healthier lifestyle because of it, and that is great. And I just want to say Cold Aussie became a subscriber tonight because she wants the Bits episode, the part 3. So
yes,
thank you
it's
very
coming
much
up.
For that.
We're doing the final edit. It's going to be incredible. And we want to learn all about Australia.
And it's interesting. Everybody's starting to, say bye and end the evening, but I think we should go into overtime. We had planned on saying a little statement about the community a little bit. So I'd say before everybody heads out, stick around. There might be a little surprise at the end.
Well, let's see here. Let's do this. I'm going to read. We're going to cap off the actual show here with this, which is from the Occult Review. This is from 1922. It's a theosophical publication. The name of the article is Psychic Science and Occultism in Scandinavia and Among the Laplanders. And this is something I was going to include in the Laplander section. So thank you for letting me fill in here. We have to understand the Laplanders, their healing techniques, their mystical abilities, and all the rest of it. But the Occult Review, okay, this is the article, and as I said, it's by Horace Leaf. Okay, so they're talking about Mr. Tieran, who went and lived among, he's an explorer, and he went and lived among the Laplanders for years and years and learned all these incredible things. And I've been listening to what he recorded, actually, in terms of what the Laplanders do as songs to go into trance and stuff. Quite remarkable. But anyway, he says, one day Mr. Tyrann ordered this man to conduct a party of Laps across a river. And this was somebody who was in the Swedish government. And he basically was there kind of learning about the culture. And this guy, Tyrann, he has this kind of minister of culture who's visiting. And he says, okay, well, I'm going to tell you to do something. Lead a party of Laps across a river, a task the man disliked very much. For some reason, he felt it was beneath him or something. And he showed his resentment by treating the Laplanders in a shameful manner, subjecting them to various kinds of indignities. Now, the natives yielded meekly to his bullying, but as soon as they reached the opposite shore, a change took place in their demeanor. One of the Laplanders, who was evidently the chief among the party, and who had been the principal object of the Swede's bad temper, turned to him and said, "You've had your turn. Now wait a minute. I will give you something that your strength cannot resist." Unquote. He thereupon advanced some distance up the shore and deliberately made a small clay image, intimating that later he would shoot it. Now, this practice of shooting is regarded as a deadly form of magic among the Laplanders, who believe that when performed by a qualified person, the death of the individual that the clay effigy represents will take place. It's basically voodoo. The Swedish workman appeared not to believe in the power and treated the Laplanders' conduct with contempt. So here's this guy visiting who's still giving them a hard time. That evening, he and Carl Tyrann, who was the explorer who lives among the Laplanders, shared the same cabin. According to Tyrann, his companion fell fast asleep. In the middle of the night, however, the man suddenly sprang up with a loud cry and, placing his hands over his heart, cried, "My God, I am shot," and fell dead. Tyrann is looking around. Nobody shot anybody. What happened to this guy? Post-mortem examinations show that the unfortunate man was perfectly healthy, the verdict of the doctors being that he must have died from heart failure. It's quite interesting. I'm showing the dark side of the Laplanders. There's so much about their healing techniques and all the rest of it. But when they were treated poorly like this, they have this incredible mystical ability to use in their defense. Now, what's fascinating is I found a story about Ivan the Terrible planning to take over where the Laps were. And he heard and was getting these indications from different people in Europe that he couldn't do it because the retribution would be too great from their magic, basically. And so the story is that he went to them and said, "I'm not going to attack you, but I want 3 of your best psychics, basically, for me back in Russia." So it's quite an unusual story, but it makes sense to me because they really lived by themselves. They were hill people, and they were just in a different reality. Now, if our own deep state recruited Laplanders in order to form an astral aspect of this XProtect group, which is protecting the UFO file and the X technology therein, that explains the whole, they look a little like this type, Asian, kind of Asian, and then boom, shown the Laplanders, and according to Keel, 100% of the witnesses said they look like that Laplander woman. So that's what a man in black looks like. Were they recruited? Where are they operating from? These are the questions that we're rolling out of the show with. And we are, I think that really kind of sums up the show. We're going to do more on the Laplanders. Don't worry. It strikes me that there's so much more to learn there, and their healing techniques are fascinating. And I'm sorry that we've run out of time tonight to talk about it, but we will. We're going to bring them back in full scale. And maybe that's one that we're going to have Gigi on, because she can really tap in to the kind of work, that kind of really intense work that they're doing. Okay.
I just want to say it's incredibly ironic what has happened, because the blue chickens have not come up at all.
Hey.
Not once in the chat. I'm bringing them up. And so we were all prepared because there's just all this psi opera going on as a...
Well, what happened, it's very simple. Somebody from the blue chickens put a list, like an enemies list, out on Twitter, and he put me on it, and he put Joe from the Carolinas, and he put Unirock on it. And he's Corey's kid, you know, and they sponsored him. They found him in a gym, and they rolled him out there. Corey's manager thought he had potential, and he could go out and do all that stuff. So everyone, you know, knows him and the stuff that he does. And he was included in some of my New Age Deep State reports just because he worked for Corey Good. And, you know, I didn't have anything against him, but that's the whole Corey's kid thing where they rolled them out to try to present the secret space program. They had a marketing campaign. So the good thing now, you know, their fortunes are declining. They're in a war with Gaia, whatever it happens to be. There's all that junk. But I basically did my reporting, you know, I put my 5 episodes out about them, and I held the 6th. And that was kind of as far as I left it. But hearing from them was kind of like a weird blast from the past. And, you know, they working through this guy, you know, who really is just coming out and just with this kind of weird stuff on YouTube, you know, you can do whatever you want, and you can have fun with it or whatever, but you can't put up a shill list, enemy list, all this kind of stuff. And, you know, with me, I can take it. I'm used to how the blue chickens operate. You know, the blue chicken cultists are not long for this world. As a matter of fact, Gaia just replaced them with someone who kind of sounds like a bad imitation of what they used to do. So, you know, that's just the blue chickens for you. They've been out there. My whole thing about them is that they were kind of put out there to distract from genuine secret space program research. And they got into very culty activities, and they got into, you know, every time you would expose that, they'd send a legal threat to me or all that kind of stuff. But this thing, a list on Twitter, really didn't sit well with me, mostly because of the other people that were on it too, who were doing honest reports. And so to cover up their own kind of shoddy reporting, they were like, you know, here's this, basically this enemies list. So the way that I look at that is it has to be something that's roundly rejected. Because if you disagree with people, that's one thing. But if you're going to like go around putting people on lists, then you're no kind of a journalist. And, you know, it's offensive and worse. So that's the way that I felt about it. And basically, again, I would say in terms of the work that we do, going to have to choose the good stuff, because the marketing ops and the intel ops are squeezing. You know, they want every dollar. They want to harvest the reality. And they don't like work. You know, they don't like the Alexandra Bruces. They don't like the dark journalists. They don't like the Catherine Austin Fitts, because they expose the real thing, and they can't make money putting together these kind of Gaia-ish fantasies. So all those people are doing what Catherine Fitts calls the Midian thing, where they're shooting at each other. But in the middle of that, they took a shot at some really good people. So, you know, I'm just not up for that. And I've made my responses on it. And on here, I'll just say, you know, I don't go for that kind of stuff. So you're not going to make lists about people and have me be quiet about it.
Is it time to tell the Sigmund story?
Well,
tell the Sigmund.
Let's just say, I will say this, that all those people involved with all that junk, basically, they created a lot of different devices and scenarios, and I really don't think people even care about their stories anymore. So in that sense, I do think that we're doing you know, we're doing something good here, which is that people are moving away from the junk conspiracy. See, dark journalism, I'm going to end with this, goes simple like this. Dark journalism starts with the official story, the counter story, and the junk conspiracy. The official story is what's in place. There is no secret space program, for example. The counter story is Gary McKinnon found a list that he hacked into NASA and found. It talked about an off-world officers list. We've seen all this money disappearing from the federal budget, the missing trillions. So we have these groups, you know, who come out there and try to borrow these things and make up their own wild story. And they say, I'm a galactic ambassador. That's the junk conspiracy. So the junk conspiracy is meant to drive the counter story people to look somewhere else, back to the official story for the sane reality. So you've got those three levels: the official story, the counter story, which is usually right, because you have a lot of professors, a lot of writers, and good researchers in there. And, you know, the way that it works out is the junk conspiracy, we're always floating in that junk conspiracy because flat earth and all the rest of it. Hey, you know, that's the way it goes in the alternative. But I will say this, that I think it looks better and better, the opportunity that's presenting itself when we get the knowledge of the mystery schools lined up behind the X Steganography work. We get a chance, I think, to get a snapshot of something real going on, instead of being played by, you know, Emery Smith and 3,000 alien autopsies or something like that. I mean, let's weigh that kind of junk versus the valuable work that John Keel left behind. The imbalance is gigantic. So that's the work that I go for. That's what I'm looking for. And, you know, I would never make an enemies list for anything. I mean, what's funny about the enemies list is that's something that Nixon had for journalists. The idea that somebody would think that they were a journalist and make an enemies list is just erroneous and asinine. So my take on it is you have some junior YouTubers out there who need to develop real journalistic skills. And that's the kind of thing I think we need to encourage. And with that, Miss Olivia, wow, what an incredible evening. Great questions.
That was great.
Too. Did I miss any questions?
Well, there were some great questions that I'll show you after the show, but they just weren't on topic. So I tried to stay with the Men in Black questions.
Nicely done. Coming up in October, incredible. We have the two-parter, whenever that 30th episode is. I forget, it's October 11th, I think. And we're going to have Joseph Farrell back, Gigi Young. Hopefully she's coming back with us in October, and her work is absolutely fascinating. I highly recommend it. Amazing work coming forward on transhumanism that we're working on. The Ex-Witness and Susan Manowich. Just a great lineup coming up for October and November. This is where we're going to be. And what I would say is make sure that you're on the Dark Journalist newsletter. Go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter, keep us online with each other. I see Plan B out there. It's great to see you. Great to have you, CC Jarvis. And Gigi, hey, there's Gigi. It's great to see you, Gigi. Incredible videos and incredible work that Gigi's doing. And a cult fan, June Martin, Quiet Storm, fantastic. Wow, great group tonight. We will see you all next week.
Okay, thanks everybody.
What's for dinner?
Well, I can tell you one thing. We've been having too much linguine, so maybe not that tonight.
We've been watching a lot of Dirty Harry.
Yes.
There's a lot of food references. One of them is, who's we, sucker? Well, no, what's the other one? There's the sugar one you were going to do.
No, it's
the hot dog.
Hot dog.
Okay.
So
what is that?
We'll have hot dogs with mustard and relish, because nobody puts ketchup on a hot dog.
Yeah. Well, that's the Dirty Harry part. But what are we really going to have?
I don't know.
It's getting late. I'm hungry.
Yeah.
See, I'm not a Man in Black. Well, not yet. Anyway, keep that astral agency away. Thanks, everyone. Great night. Fantastic crowd. Wow. We went there deep with XProtect, and it's only going to get deeper because next week we're going where no X program has gone before. And we will see you next week.
See you next week.
Happy travels, Jennifer. I know you're traveling tonight, and it's going to go well. Bye, Tessa. We'll have to talk about Philip and his Men in Black experiences. I can't wait. And Lee Veltman to see you out there too. Wow, everybody's here. This is great. This is more like Olivia's job. See this? I'm really into it. Bye, everyone.